There is a particular kind of silence that exists beneath the surface of the ocean, not the silence of an empty room or the quiet of a still night, but something older, heavier, more indifferent. It is the silence of a world that does not care whether you live or die, a world where pressure builds with every meter of descent, where darkness is absolute, and where the only sounds are the groaning of steel under stress and the distant, muffled percussion of things that want to kill you. Men chose to go down into that silence. They chose it, trained for it, and in some cases gave everything they had to it, not because they were reckless, not because they were without fear, but because that was the war they had been given, and in that war, the ocean was both their weapon and their cage. Tonight, we are going to tell you about one of those men. His name was Heinrich Bleichrodt. And if that name does not immediately ring bells for you, that is part of why this story matters, because the history of the Second World War is often told through the loudest voices, the most famous battles, the most documented victories and catastrophes. But beneath those headline stories, quite literally, beneath the surface, there are quieter histories. Longer, slower, more complicated ones. Histories of men who existed in conditions most of us cannot fully imagine, serving within systems that history has rightly condemned, while themselves living lives that resist simple judgment. Bleichrodt was not a fanatic. He was not a propagandist. He was, by most accounts of those who served with him and those who later studied him, a professional naval officer, shaped by the sea, by his country, by his era, and by the particular machinery of a war that consumed an entire generation of young Europeans on every side of the conflict. He commanded submarines at a time when submarine warfare was the most psychologically demanding form of combat yet devised by human beings. Not the brief, violent intensity of an infantry charge, not the mechanical distance of an artillery barrage, but something in between, long weeks of patient, grinding endurance, punctuated by minutes of terrifying action, followed by longer weeks of silence and pressure, and the slow management of fear inside a steel tube roughly the length of 2 cricket pitches, shared with 40 or 50 other human beings who were depending on your judgment to keep them alive. He did this across multiple commands, across multiple years, across an Atlantic that grew more dangerous with every passing month as the Allied response sharpened, expanded, and eventually turned the hunter into the hunted. This is the story of how a boy from the German coast became one of the more accomplished submarine commanders of the Second World War. How he rose through a naval service rebuilding itself from the humiliation of the First World War. How he adapted, survived, and ultimately bore witness to the collapse of the nation and the ideology that had sent him to sea in the first place. And how history, which is never quite as neat as we would like, has been working out what to do with him ever since. We are going to take our time with this story. That is the nature of the documentary you have chosen tonight, and it is also, in a way, the nature of submarine warfare itself. There is no shortcut through the deep ocean. You cannot rush the pressure. You cannot hurry the dark. You can only understand it by staying inside it long enough for your eyes to adjust. So if you are settled in for the night, and we hope you are, find yourself a comfortable position. Let your shoulders drop. Let the tension of the day begin to release. Because what follows is more than 2 hours of careful, measured history, told not to glorify or condemn, but to understand, to reconstruct, as honestly as we can, the life of a man who existed at one of the most consequential and devastating crossroads of the 20th century. If you are new to this channel, this is what we do here. Long-form histories, patient storytelling, documentaries built for the kind of listening you do when the world has quieted down and your mind is finally ready to receive something more than noise. We cover the wars, the machines, the strategies, but more than any of that, we cover the people. Because history is not made by forces or ideologies alone. It is made by individuals, fallible and complex, navigating circumstances they did not entirely choose. If that is the kind of history you value, please subscribe. There is more coming, much more, and every subscriber makes it possible for us to keep producing work at this level. Hit the notification bell if you want to be among the first to know when the next documentary lands. And if someone shared this with you, or you found it by accident at an hour when the rest of the world is asleep, welcome. You are exactly where you are supposed to be. Now, back to the North Sea. Back to the particular quality of grey light that hangs over the German coast in the early years of the 20th century, when a boy named Heinrich Bleichrodt was growing up in a world that still carried the shape of the old German Empire. Its pride, its ambitions, its certainties, even as that world was already beginning to fracture. A world where the sea was not an abstraction or a holiday destination, but a working reality, a source of livelihood and identity, something you grew up alongside and eventually learned to read the way others read books. That boy would go on to serve in the waning months of the First World War, joining a navy already in the process of dissolution. He would navigate the strange, constrained years of the Weimar Republic and the Versailles restrictions that kept German naval power deliberately small. He would watch, from inside the institution, as those restrictions were gradually discarded and a new fleet, including a new submarine arm, was assembled with a speed and ambition that told anyone paying attention exactly where things were heading. And then he would go to sea, again and again, in vessels that the German Navy called Unterseeboots, U-boats, and that the crews who served inside them called, with varying degrees of affection and dark humour, iron coffins. Because that is what they were, sometimes, and everyone knew it. But Heinrich Bleichrodt went anyway, and what happened across the years that followed, in the cold grey swells of the North Atlantic, in the treacherous waters off the British Isles, in the distant reaches of the Indian Ocean, is a story that has never fully been told in the way it deserves to be told. Until now. This is that story. Settle in. The river knows before the boy does. Long before he could name what pulled him toward the water, Heinrich Bleichrodt grew up alongside the Weser, one of the great northern arteries of Germany, a river that carries salt on its breath in the mornings and the smell of engine oil and rope tar in the afternoons. The towns that line its banks were never quite inland and never quite coastal, suspended between the agricultural heart of the country and the open North Sea waiting at the river's mouth like a patient, enormous fact. For a boy growing up in this region in the early years of the 20th century, the water was not a backdrop. It was a grammar. Everything else, school, family, the changing of seasons, was translated through it. His family carried the sea in their history, the way other families carry land or trade. Maritime life along the Weser was not romantic in the way outsiders imagined it. It was practical, physical, and often unforgiving, a way of life built from tides and cargo manifests, from harbour schedules and the repair of things that the ocean had broken. The men of Bleichrodt's world understood vessels not as adventure, but as tools, as responsibilities, as extensions of professional identity. His upbringing absorbed all of this without ceremony. The stories told around tables in those households were not tales of conquest over the sea. They were stories about managing it, reading it, and respecting what it could take from you if you turned careless. Germany in the first decade of the 1900s was a nation pressed forward by its own ambitions. The Kaiser's government had invested enormously in naval expansion. The High Seas Fleet was a source of national pride, a political project as much as a military one, designed to announce German power to the world and to rival the dominance of the British Royal Navy. For a boy near the Weser, this was not abstract geopolitics. The fleet was visible in the culture around him. Naval officers carried social prestige. The sight of warships moving through northern waters was a common one. The idea that a young man might serve in this force, that he might one day stand on a bridge above grey northern water, wearing the uniform of the Imperial German Navy, was not a distant fantasy. It was a plausible and respected path. When the First World War erupted in the summer of 1914, Bleichrodt was still too young to fight. He spent the war's early years in the particular frustration of adolescence during conflict, old enough to understand what was happening, young enough to be told to wait. The war reshaped everything around him. Fathers and older brothers disappeared into uniform. The coastal communities of northern Germany felt the war's economic pressure almost immediately, as British naval blockades began strangling German supply lines. Food became scarcer. The proud efficiency of pre-war German commerce gave way to scarcity and improvisation. For a boy growing up near the water, the blockade was not an abstraction in a newspaper. It had a texture: the empty shelves, the thinner meals, the quiet tension in adult faces that children always notice and rarely fully understand. The German Navy's response to the British blockade was submarine warfare. This was not initially a source of pride. U-boats in the early years of the war operated under a cloud of controversy. Their tactics challenged the existing rules of naval engagement, which had been built around the visible and the gentlemanly. A submarine could not take prisoners easily. It could not always give warning before striking. It operated by concealment rather than confrontation. The established naval powers viewed this with something between alarm and contempt. But Germany's strategic position demanded asymmetric solutions, and the U-boat arm expanded rapidly, moving from a minor experimental force into one of the most consequential weapons of the naval war. For a generation of young Germans watching from the shore, the submarine became something new, dangerous, unconventional, and undeniably effective. By the time Bleichrodt was old enough to enter service, the war had ground into its brutal final years. The entry into the Kaiserliche Marine, the Imperial German Navy, at this stage was not the glorious initiation a younger version of him might have imagined before 1914. The war had consumed its early optimism entirely. Losses had been catastrophic across all branches. The U-boat campaign had inflicted serious damage on Allied shipping, but at enormous cost to German crews. The casualty rates among submarine personnel were harrowing by any measure. The men who had survived multiple patrols were marked by it in ways that even they could not always articulate. To join the Navy in these years was to enter an institution already bearing tremendous weight. His initial training and early service placed him within structures that were simultaneously proud and exhausted. The professional ethos of the Kaiserliche Marine remained fierce. Discipline, technical precision, and an almost devotional commitment to seamanship were its core values, and these did not erode easily even as the broader war deteriorated. Bleichrodt absorbed this culture at the precise moment when it was being tested most severely. The officers and petty officers who shaped his early naval education were men formed by a pre-war service tradition that valued endurance and self-mastery above demonstrative courage. You did not talk about fear, you prepared, you executed. You maintained the machinery and the discipline and the watch schedule, because the sea did not care about your emotional state, and neither did the enemy. The war ended before Bleichrodt could accumulate significant operational experience, and the armistice of November 1918 landed on Germany like a blow to something more than territory. The country that emerged from those final months of conflict was not simply defeated, it was disoriented, humiliated, and searching for explanations that its institutions struggled to provide. The naval tradition that had shaped Bleichrodt's early ambitions had its own particular wound to process. The High Seas Fleet, that enormous investment in national prestige, had spent most of the war at anchor, its one great confrontation with the British at Jutland indecisive, and at the war's end, it had been handed over to the Allies at Scapa Flow. For naval officers of any rank or experience, this was not merely a military defeat. It was a kind of professional shame that sat apart from the general humiliation of the peace settlement. The Treaty of Versailles imposed terms on German military capability that were designed to be permanent. Naval restrictions were among the most severe. Germany was permitted only a small surface fleet, no submarines whatsoever, and sharp limits on the size and armament of any vessel it was allowed to build. The instrument that had given Bleichrodt his first professional identity, the great German Navy, was systematically dismantled. What remained was called the Kriegsmarine, a shadow force operating under constant scrutiny and constraint. For a young officer who had grown up believing in the Navy as an expression of national capability and individual purpose, this reduction was a formative humiliation. It did not destroy his commitment. If anything, it calcified something in it, a determination that would wait, quietly, for circumstances to change. Post-war Germany offered its young generation a world of disappointment made vivid by daily life. Inflation destroyed savings. Political instability made the future seem genuinely unknowable. The Weimar Republic that replaced the Kaiser's government was perpetually embattled, contested from the left and the right, undermined by economic catastrophe, and unable to provide the sense of restored order that most Germans desperately wanted. For men who had entered military service with a clear set of values and found those values attached to a state that had collapsed, the 1920s were a decade of professional and personal recalibration. The Navy gave some of them continuity, a structure to inhabit while everything around it shifted. What the years between the wars did to men like Bleichrodt is both simple and difficult to articulate. It did not make them political in any obvious sense. The professional military culture he inhabited maintained its distance from the ideological street battles of the Republic's years. But it also did not leave them unchanged. The combination of wartime formation, the particular shame of the naval surrender, and the grinding disappointment of Weimar austerity produced a generation of officers who had absorbed the idea of national restoration as something close to a professional obligation. They were not fanatics. They were professionals waiting for the conditions under which professionalism could again mean something. The approaching conflict of the 1930s would give them those conditions, in the most terrible way imaginable. The river had always known before the boy did. It had known the direction of things, the pull toward depth, toward the open water, toward the grey and consequential distances of the North Sea. Bleichrodt grew up beside it, carrying its grammar inside him, learning without formal instruction the difference between the manageable and the overwhelming. Those early years formed him before the war, and before the ideology, and before the history. They formed a professional, a northerner, a man of the water. What that formation would mean, in the years ahead, was still some distance away. The Germany that Heinrich Bleichrodt returned to was not the Germany that had sent its young men to war. It was smaller, poorer, and hollowed out by the terms dictated at Versailles in 1919, a settlement that stripped the nation of territory, treasure, and, most critically for a boy from the Weser, the instruments of sea power that had defined German ambition for a generation. The High Seas Fleet, that great iron expression of Kaiser Wilhelm's maritime dreams, had sailed itself to Scapa Flow and then to the bottom, scuttled by its own crews rather than surrendered whole to British hands. What remained of German naval identity was less a force than a memory, and into that memory, young Bleichrodt walked as a professional, determined to find something worth salvaging. The Versailles Treaty had been precise in its cruelty toward German sea power. The new Kriegsmarine was permitted no more than 15,000 men. Capital ships were reduced to a handful of pre-dreadnought relics, their tonnage capped at 10,000 tons each. Submarines were banned outright, not restricted, not limited, but forbidden entirely, a deliberate amputation of the one weapon that had come closest to breaking the British stranglehold on German commerce during the war just ended. For a young naval officer of Bleichrodt's generation, this was the professional landscape he inherited, a service stripped of its purpose, operating under the watchful contempt of former enemies, forbidden from developing the very capabilities that might have given it meaning. It was, in every strategic sense, a navy in name only. Yet organizations under pressure do not simply wither, they adapt, they preserve, and they plan. The officers of the Kriegsmarine understood that treaties were political instruments, not permanent conditions, and that the competence of their men was the one asset no foreign power could confiscate. Bleichrodt trained accordingly. He absorbed navigation, gunnery, signals, engineering, and the broader craft of seamanship with the methodical intensity of a man who knew that the moment restrictions lifted, only the best prepared would be ready. The surface fleet that remained, those few permitted vessels, became his classroom, and the North Sea and Baltic became the waters in which theory was tested against the indifferent reality of weather and tide. He was learning his trade in a period when the trade itself was barely legal. The 1920s were a decade of peculiar contradictions for Germany. The Weimar Republic struggled to hold a fractured society together, lurching between inflation so severe that ordinary wages became worthless within days of being paid, and periods of fragile stability sustained largely by American credit. Political violence was not exceptional but routine. Veterans of the trenches and the sea war existed in a landscape that had no clear role for them, their sacrifice officially acknowledged and personally unresolved. Bleichrodt, as a serving officer, was insulated from the worst of this chaos by the structure of the service, but no man of his generation moved through those years without absorbing their texture, the sense that something had broken that ordinary politics could not repair. That background note of crisis became part of how his generation understood the world. The Kriegsmarine, constrained as it was, maintained its professional culture with genuine discipline. Promotions were slow, resources were scarce, and the average officer served long years in junior roles, mastering each level of responsibility before advancement came. This enforced patience had an unintentional benefit. It produced officers of unusual depth, men who might, in a larger and more comfortable navy, have moved quickly upward without fully understanding the mechanics of command, instead spent years doing the unglamorous work, watch duties, administrative assignments, the repetitive maintenance of systems that had to function regardless of what the political world was doing. Bleichrodt moved through these years accumulating exactly that kind of experience, unremarkable in the records and invaluable in practice. The Kriegsmarine's unofficial relationship with submarine development during this period deserves a measured word. While the treaty's prohibitions were explicit, German naval thinking about submarine warfare never entirely ceased. Engineers and officers worked through front companies, through cooperation with foreign navies, through technical study and theoretical development, preserving institutional knowledge about submarine design and tactics in forms that could survive the treaty's restrictions. Bleichrodt was not yet connected to these efforts in any direct sense. He was building his surface career, his sea time, his officer credentials. But the fact of their existence meant that when the prohibition eventually lifted, the knowledge required to move rapidly would not have to be reconstructed from nothing. The groundwork was being laid beneath the surface in more ways than one. By the early 1930s, the political weather in Germany was changing in ways that every serving officer could feel, even if the implications were not yet fully clear. The Weimar Republic was failing, its coalition governments collapsing, its credibility exhausted by unemployment that reached figures few democracies survive, and from this failure, a different kind of politics was gathering force. The Kriegsmarine, like all the armed services, existed in a complex relationship with this transformation. Officers were professionals who had sworn institutional loyalty, not personal allegiance to any politician, yet the promise of expansion, of resources, of restored national purpose was not something they could simply ignore. For men who had spent more than a decade constrained by treaty limits, the prospect of a navy with ships, and eventually submarines, was professionally irresistible. Bleichrodt continued to develop as an officer through this transitional period, gaining command experience and technical competence that would define his approach to the years ahead. His character, as it emerges from later accounts, was that of a man who thought carefully and acted decisively, qualities that the Reichsmarine's long, slow interregnum had, perhaps unintentionally, cultivated. The years of doing more with less, of maintaining standards without adequate equipment, of keeping men focused during months when nothing of consequence seemed to happen, all of this had shaped him. He was becoming the kind of officer who could hold a crew together, not through spectacular gestures, but through the quiet authority of someone who had learned his profession completely. The Anglo-German Naval Agreement of 1935 marked the moment when the strategic fiction of German compliance with Versailles was openly and formally discarded, at least in the naval sphere. Britain, in a calculation that would be questioned for years afterward, agreed that Germany could rebuild its navy to 35% of Royal Navy tonnage, and crucially, that Germany could possess submarines, up to 45% of British submarine strength, and potentially up to 100% in exceptional circumstances. For the Reichsmarine, now rebranding itself the Kriegsmarine, this was not merely a treaty revision. It was an opening, a legal doorway through which the suppressed ambitions and carefully preserved knowledge of 2 decades could finally move into the open. The U-boat arm, dormant for nearly 20 years on paper, but never entirely dead in practice, could now be built. Bleichrodt was approaching 40 years of professional service, shaped entirely by an institution that had never been allowed to fully express itself. He had come of age as a naval officer under the shroud of strategic defeat, had maintained his competence through years of political instability and resource scarcity, and had watched as the world around him shifted in ways that made conflict feel not merely possible, but increasingly probable. Other men in similar positions sought ways out, or accommodated themselves to diminished expectations. Bleichrodt moved toward the submarine service, the arm that represented everything the Versailles system had tried to erase, and the one that Dönitz, its new chief, believed could alter the terms of the next war entirely. It is worth pausing on what this long interregnum had created. A generation of German naval officers had been compressed. Professionally, psychologically, strategically, they had been told, year after year, that the instrument they served was insufficient, that the mission it might pursue was forbidden, that the capabilities they admired were impermissible, And then, within a relatively short span of years, those restrictions began to dissolve. The energy that had been held in place by treaty law and political circumstance did not dissipate. It accumulated. When the doors opened, it moved quickly and with considerable force. The Reichsmarine's slow, patient, sometimes covert preservation of its professional culture was about to meet the operational reality it had been waiting for, without fully admitting so. Bleichrodt's years in the Reichsmarine were not, in any conventional sense, years of drama. No significant battles, no famous exploits, no moments that history records with particular clarity. They were the years of formation, of a professional made careful by scarcity, precise by necessity, and capable by long exposure to a service that had to function correctly because it could not afford to function otherwise. Europe was drifting toward its second catastrophe in 3 decades, and the men who would prosecute that war at sea were already in place, already shaped, already waiting. What they waited for was not peace. It was, though few would have said so plainly, the chance to demonstrate what they had spent 20 years quietly learning to do. By the middle of the 1930s, something was stirring beneath the surface of European politics, and beneath the surface of the sea itself. Germany had spent nearly 2 decades living under the weight of the Versailles Treaty's naval clauses, a set of restrictions designed to ensure that the Kaiser's catastrophic fleet could never rise again. Shipyards that had once rung with the sound of hammers and the hiss of hot steel had fallen quiet, reduced to building commercial vessels and maintaining the small, neutered force permitted under international supervision. But restrictions, as history repeatedly demonstrates, are only as durable as the will to enforce them, and in the summer of 1935, that will collapsed with a signed piece of paper. The Anglo-German naval agreement handed Berlin something it had not possessed since the armistice: the legal right to rebuild. Germany was now permitted a surface fleet up to 35% of British tonnage, and, crucially, a submarine force up to 45% of the Royal Navy's own submarine strength. For the men who had spent years quietly preparing, quietly planning, quietly waiting, it was the opening of a door they had been standing behind for a very long time. Karl Dönitz was 43 years old when he was given command of the newly reconstituted U-Boat arm in the autumn of 1935. He was not a flashy man. He did not speak in grand proclamations or indulge in the theatrical performance that characterized so many figures of that era. What he possessed instead was something rarer and, in the end, more dangerous: a precise, analytical mind, combined with an absolute conviction that the submarine was the decisive weapon of any war Germany might fight against Britain. He had served in U-boats during the First World War, had been captured when his vessel was lost in the Mediterranean in 1918, and had spent his years as a prisoner of war, and the long interregnum that followed, turning over in his mind the lessons of the previous conflict. Where earlier commanders had deployed submarines as individual hunters operating alone, Dönitz envisioned something more coordinated, more devastating. He called it the Rudeltaktik, what the world would come to know as the Wolf Pack. Groups of submarines, directed by radio from shore command, converging on convoys in darkness, overwhelming the escorts, striking from multiple directions. It was a doctrine born from frustration with what submarine warfare had failed to achieve, and it demanded not just boats, but the right kind of men to crew them. For Heinrich Bleichrodt, the opening of the U-boat arm represented something more personal than a shift in strategic doctrine. He had spent his early naval career in surface vessels, developing the seamanship and professional discipline that the Reichsmarine demanded of its officers. He had watched the constraints of the post-war years with the same quiet dissatisfaction shared by many of his contemporaries, men who had chosen a naval career in a navy that was, for much of its existence, forbidden from becoming what it needed to be. The U-boat arm offered something different. It offered purpose, technical challenge, and a sense that the profession they had each chosen might finally matter in the way they had always believed it could. When Bleichrodt transferred into the submarine service in the mid-1930s, he was not alone in that decision. An entire generation of ambitious, capable officers was making the same calculation, drawn by Dönitz's vision and by the straightforward reality that this was where Germany's naval future was being built. The training that awaited them was not designed to flatter. Dönitz had no interest in producing officers who could pass examinations and look correct in their uniforms. He wanted commanders, men who could make rapid decisions under extreme pressure, manage crews in confined spaces without adequate sleep, navigate by calculation and instinct when visibility was zero, and fight with the coolness of someone who had genuinely accepted the possibility of not returning. The submarine school curriculum covered navigation, torpedo mechanics, attack procedures, damage control, and the complex art of diving and trimming a boat to maintain stealth and stability simultaneously. Trainees were put through simulated emergencies, equipment failures, flooding scenarios, not to frighten them, but to reduce panic to something manageable, to turn instinctive fear into practiced response. The men who broke under this regime were quietly redirected. The men who held together under it were the ones Dönitz wanted at the helm of his boats. One of the central challenges of submarine warfare that the training relentlessly drilled was the conflict between aggression and caution. A U-boat commander who was too hesitant missed opportunities that might not return. Convoys moved on. Positions changed. The window for an attack closed in minutes. But a commander who was reckless brought his crew to the bottom with him. The balance between these poles was not a formula that could be taught in a classroom. It was something that had to be absorbed through repetitive practice, through exercises where every decision carried consequence, through the gradual accumulation of the kind of confidence that comes only from having navigated difficult situations and emerged from them intact. Bleichrodt absorbed this balance with the same methodical seriousness he had brought to every stage of his career. Those who trained alongside him described an officer who was composed under pressure, quick to assess a situation, and reluctant to waste either effort or words. These were exactly the qualities the U-boat service prized. Beyond the mechanical and tactical dimensions of the training, there was an atmosphere, a culture, that Dönitz cultivated deliberately within his expanding arm. The U-boat service was encouraged to think of itself as a corps apart, as men who accepted a form of duty that was categorically different from what surface sailors or soldiers experienced. There was an intimacy to submarine service that had no parallel elsewhere in the military. A crew of 40 or 50 men lived in a space smaller than most modest apartments, sharing the same recycled air, eating the same meals from the same cramped galley, tolerating each other's habits and moods across weeks at sea without the possibility of escape or privacy. In this environment, the relationship between a commander and his crew was not merely professional. It was something closer to the relationship between the decisions of one man and the survival of all. Dönitz understood this, and he selected and shaped his commanders accordingly. The culture he built was one of mutual obligation, of uncommon trust, and of a kind of pride that came from knowing that few men would or could do what they were being asked to do. By the later years of the 1930s, as the training program expanded and the new boats slid one by one from their yards into grey Baltic waters, there was an increasing sense among U-boat officers that the exercises and the planning were converging towards something real. Political events made the direction of travel difficult to mistake. Germany had remilitarized the Rhineland, absorbed Austria, claimed the Sudetenland. Each step was met with protest and ultimately accommodation, which seemed only to confirm that the trajectory of European events was not going to correct itself quietly. Dönitz had begun his command with fewer than 10 operational submarines. By the middle of 1939, that number had grown substantially, though it remained far below the figure he had calculated was necessary to wage the kind of campaign he envisioned against British shipping. He believed he needed something in the region of 300 operational boats to throttle the supply lines that kept Britain alive. He had a fraction of that. What he had, however, were trained crews, men who had spent years preparing for a war that now seemed to be racing toward them. For Bleichrodt, these final years of peacetime training carried a particular weight. He had by now completed his submarine qualification, had handled boats in exercises, and worked through the specific demands of torpedo attack approaches, of evasion, of the long, patient waiting that defined so much of what a submarine commander actually did. The skills were accumulating, and alongside them a clearer understanding of what the reality of combat operations at sea would actually require. Peacetime exercises had rules, constraints designed to prevent accidents, to allow the training to conclude with all participants intact. Real operations would have none of those constraints. The sea would not ease off to prevent a tragedy, and an enemy who located a submerged U-boat would not pull his punches to allow the crew an opportunity to learn from the experience. Bleichrodt understood this distinction, and it seems to have sharpened rather than discouraged him. There was also something in these final pre-war months that is difficult to name precisely, but which appears in the memoirs and accounts of many U-boat officers of the period. A kind of clarity, the ambiguity of the interwar years, the uncertain purpose, the limited equipment, the sense of professional capability without a professional outlet, was giving way to something that, however dark its implications, was at least definitive. Germany was going to war. The U-boat arm was going to war. The years of planning and drilling and theoretical doctrine were about to meet the one test that could not be simulated. Among Bleichrodt's peers, there was anxiety, but there was also a resolve that had been forged across the preceding years and was now hardening into something permanent. By the time the summer of 1939 drew to its close, and the first reports of German ground forces crossing into Poland reached naval headquarters, Dönitz's boats were already at sea. Some had departed before the formal declaration of war, positioned in the Atlantic on the assumption that events were moving too quickly to wait. The machinery of the conflict was engaged before its declaration had dried on the page. For Bleichrodt, full operational command still lay slightly ahead, but the path to it had been laid with precision across the preceding years. The training was done, the doctrine was set, the boats were out, moving through grey water toward merchant lanes that had no idea yet what was coming for them. And Heinrich Bleichrodt, now a man in his early 30s with a full submariner's qualification and a career built on quiet competence, was ready to discover what all of it actually meant. Not on a training range in the Baltic, but in the deep water of a war that would spare no one. There is a particular weight to a first command, not the weight of rank, or of ceremony, or of the polished formality of a commissioning parade, but the weight of a vessel beneath your feet, responsive to your judgment alone, carrying men whose lives will be shaped by decisions you have not yet made. When Heinrich Bleichrodt stepped aboard U-48 in the autumn of 1939, he inherited something more than a submarine. He inherited a reputation. U-48 was not a blank slate. She was a Type 5E boat, a refinement of the earlier design, longer in the pressure hull, carrying additional fuel, capable of reaching farther into the Atlantic than her predecessors. But beyond her specifications, she carried something harder to measure. Previous commanders had already taken her into the North Atlantic and returned with tonnage figures that were spoken of with quiet envy in the officers' messes along the German coast. The boat had a record. She had already drawn blood, and the men who sailed her knew the difference between a vessel that had been tested and one that had merely been launched. Bleichrodt was stepping into a seat that others had already warmed, a command that already had its own identity. His task was not only to prove himself, it was to prove that he belonged alongside what had come before. The crew that greeted him was a mixture of experience and youth, as was the case across much of the U-boat arm in those early months of the war. The veterans, men who had completed patrols under earlier commanders, carried themselves with the particular calm of those who have already confronted what others only imagined. The younger sailors, fresh from training establishments along the German coast, moved with a different kind of energy. Sharp, eager, not yet worn smooth by repetition or danger. Bleichrodt studied them without making a performance of it. He had learned in his years of naval service that a commander reveals himself in the small decisions first, in how he walks a boat, in what he notices, in whether his questions are genuinely curious or merely procedural. The men of U-48 were watching him with exactly the same quiet attention he was directing at them. The early months of the Second World War at sea had a character distinct from what would come later. The rules of engagement were still shifting, still uncertain. Germany had entered the conflict under the shroud of international conventions governing submarine warfare, conventions that, in theory, required U-boat commanders to warn merchant vessels before attack, to verify their identity, to allow crews to reach safety before a ship was sent to the bottom. In practice, these rules were already fraying at the edges. The British had armed many of their merchant vessels and instructed them to report submarine sightings immediately by radio. A submarine that surfaced to conduct a proper challenge was a submarine that had announced its position to every warship within radio range. The elegant protocols of an earlier era were colliding with the brutal arithmetic of modern warfare, and every commander had to navigate that collision in real time, with a crew watching and a clock running. Bleichrodt's first patrols aboard U-48 took him into the waters west of the British Isles, where the shipping lanes ran thick with vessels carrying the imports that kept the British economy alive. Coal, grain, steel, oil, the whole mechanical metabolism of an island nation at war flowed through these corridors, and the German Naval Command understood that interrupting that flow was more than a tactical objective. It was a strategic ambition to strangle Britain before her industrial and imperial resources could be fully mobilized. Bleichrodt's orders were rooted in this logic. He was not simply hunting individual ships. He was participating in a larger campaign of economic attrition that Dönitz believed could bring the war to a conclusion before it escalated into something unmanageable. Whether that belief was sound or wishful was a question for historians. In the autumn of 1939, it was simply the mission. The reality of command in those early patrols proved to be a precise education in patience. The Atlantic is vast, in a way that maps fail to communicate. Vast in its weather, vast in its silences, vast in the grinding monotony of open water, stretching in every direction to the curve of the horizon. Days would pass without a contact. The boat would run on the surface when conditions allowed, conserving battery power, the lookouts on the bridge scanning the grey immensity for a smudge of smoke or the hard line of a mast. Below, the crew existed in the compressed intimacy of the pressure hull, sleeping in rotation, eating when they could, waiting in the particular way that submariners learn to wait, with half their attention always elsewhere. Bleichrodt spent these hours understanding his boat and his men together, reading the subtle language of both. His first confirmed engagement as commanding officer of U-48 brought him face to face with the irreducible reality of what submarine warfare meant at the practical level. A merchant vessel, caught alone, crossing waters that offered no protection, became a target. The approach, the calculations, the geometry of torpedo fire, these were procedures he had rehearsed until they were automatic. But the moment between the order and the explosion is never fully captured by training. There is a pause in that moment, brief, almost imperceptible, in which the abstract becomes the concrete, in which the tactical becomes the human. Bleichrodt was not a man who appears to have been troubled by sentimentality in his professional conduct, but neither was he indifferent. He was a naval officer, doing what naval officers in wartime are required to do, a distinction that matters, even if it does not resolve every moral difficulty the situation contained. The autumn and winter of 1939 made demands on every aspect of a commander's character. The North Atlantic in that season is a place of sustained meteorological violence, storms that build without warning, seas that make the pressure hull feel fragile against the sheer force of green water breaking across the bridge, winds that tear speech apart before it leaves a man's mouth. Operating on the surface in such conditions required nerve. Submerging in them required a different kind of discipline. The faith that the boat would do what it was designed to do, that the engineers who had built her had imagined precisely this moment and had built their answers into the steel. Bleichrodt held his crew together through these conditions with the particular authority that comes not from volume or theatre, but from steadiness, from being the same man in the storm that he was in the calm. British anti-submarine measures in those early months were real, but not yet the coordinated machinery they would become. Escort vessels patrolled the approaches to home waters, and aircraft covered the waters closest to shore with growing confidence. But out in the deeper Atlantic, beyond the reach of land-based air cover, a U-boat commander still enjoyed significant freedom of movement. U-48 operated in this space, the contested middle distance where hunting was possible and the hunter was not yet reliably hunted in return. Bleichrodt learned to read the rhythms of British patrol patterns, to identify the gaps, to position his boat where the geometry of convoy routes and escort coverage created opportunity. This was not intuition. It was applied intelligence, built from accumulated observation and communicated through the careful analysis of signal traffic and operational experience. By the close of 1939, Bleichrodt had established himself as a commander of genuine competence. His tonnage figures were respectable, not yet legendary, but noted. More importantly, he had brought his crew back. In the U-boat arm, that last fact was never trivial. The boats that did not return were already accumulating in the casualty records, each loss a compound tragedy. The vessel gone, the crew gone, and with them, the irreplaceable knowledge of what it felt like to survive a patrol, to learn from it, to carry that learning into the next one. Bleichrodt had kept that knowledge alive in himself and in the men who served under him, and that was something the tonnage figures alone could not express. The officers at Lorient and Kiel who reviewed U-48's patrol reports at the end of that first year of war would have seen a picture of competent, controlled aggression, a commander who pressed his advantages without recklessness and withdrew without panic. Those are the qualities that navies prize in their submarine officers above almost everything else, because the alternative to both is catastrophic. Bleichrodt had demonstrated that he understood the shape of the game he was playing. not just the tactics of the individual patrol, but the longer rhythm of a campaign that would demand everything from the men who fought it before it was finished. What he could not yet see, standing at the beginning of his command career with the war barely 4 months old, was the scale of what was coming. The Atlantic in 1939 was already dangerous. It would become, in the years ahead, something of a different order entirely, a vast contested arena where technology and strategy would evolve faster than any single commander could fully track, where the advantages that seemed secure today would be reversed by tomorrow's intelligence or invention. The man who commanded U-48 at the end of 1939 was a capable officer finding his feet. The war he was about to enter fully was something that would test every capability he possessed and develop qualities he did not yet know he had. There is a particular kind of silence that belongs only to the deep ocean, not the silence of an empty room or a quiet street, but something far heavier, the silence of pressure, of cold water, of a steel hull holding back an entire sea. For the men who served aboard German submarines in the early years of the war, this silence was their most constant companion. It filled the hours between contacts, between attacks, between the rare moments when the ocean offered up a target and the crew could briefly feel that all of this, the discomfort, the fear, the suffocation, had a purpose. Heinrich Bleichrodt learned to live inside that silence during the months following his first operations on U-48. He did not merely endure it. He began, slowly and with deliberate patience, to understand it. The daily reality of submarine warfare bore almost no resemblance to the version circulated in German propaganda newsreels. There were no endless processions of exploding merchant ships, no triumphant surfacings beneath clear skies. What there was, instead, was routine, so grinding it bordered on punishment. The crew of a Type 5 submarine lived inside a vessel roughly 67 meters in length, crammed with torpedoes, machinery, food stores, and more than 40 human beings. The air grew stale within hours of submerging. Condensation ran down every surface. The smell, diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, mold growing in the bilges, became something a man stopped noticing only because he never truly escaped it. Bleichrodt walked among his crew during these early patrols and understood that command was not simply a matter of tactical decisions. It was a matter of managing human endurance across weeks at a time. He had inherited U-48 in a condition of earned reputation. Previous commanders had already demonstrated what the boat could do, and the crew that came with it carried that institutional confidence in their bones. This was both an advantage and a quiet pressure. The men knew what effective command looked like. They had seen it. Bleichrodt could not afford to present himself as a student of the craft while simultaneously projecting the authority a submarine captain required at every moment. The solution, he found, was observation. He watched, he listened, and he asked questions that sounded like decisions, questions that gathered information while simultaneously signaling direction. Senior petty officers who had been on patrol since the earliest months of the war became invaluable to him, not as subordinates to be directed, but as repositories of practical knowledge he could not afford to ignore. The tactical fundamentals of U-boat warfare in this period were still largely surface-based. Dönitz's doctrine called for night surface attacks wherever possible, using the submarine's low silhouette to close on convoys beyond the effective range of escort lookouts. Bleichrodt internalized this approach and began adapting it to his own instincts. He was not a reckless commander. Those who served alongside him in the officers' mess at Lorient would later describe a man who calculated before he acted, who sat with a problem longer than others might, before committing to a course. This deliberateness sometimes read as hesitation to those who did not know him. To those who did, it read as precision. There is a meaningful difference between a commander who waits because he is afraid and one who waits because he is thinking, and the men of U-48 quickly learned which kind they had. Patrol after patrol, Bleichrodt refined his approach to the approach itself, the long, careful process of closing the distance between his boat and a target without triggering alarm. The North Atlantic in the early war years was not yet saturated with Allied air cover, and a surfaced U-boat at night enjoyed a significant advantage in terms of speed and visibility. But the ocean has a way of humbling the overconfident. Weather that appeared manageable at the surface could turn within hours into conditions that made deck work genuinely life-threatening. Bleichrodt developed an almost meteorological attentiveness during this period, reading sea states and wind shifts with the kind of care that mariners in sail had once used to judge whether to leave harbour. His North Sea upbringing, those formative years on the water that had preceded his naval career, gave him a baseline understanding of how the ocean behaved that no classroom could fully replicate. Among the most significant lessons of this period was the psychology of waiting. A contact might be detected by radio intelligence or visual sighting, and a U-boat commander would then spend hours, sometimes the better part of a day, maneuvering into an attacking position. During that time, the crew could not be told what was coming. Discipline required calm, but calm is a performance, and performance requires energy, and energy is finite. Bleichrodt became skilled at reading the atmosphere aboard his boat without making the reading obvious. A joke at the right moment, a calm order delivered without urgency, the simple act of eating a meal in the control room when things grew tense. These were tools as real as any torpedo. Command at sea has always been partly theatre, and Bleichrodt came to understand this not as cynicism, but as responsibility. There were failures during these early patrols, moments when torpedoes ran erratic or detonated prematurely, when a target disappeared into a rain squall before a firing solution could be established, when a convoy escort picked up something on its ASDIC set and drove the boat deep before any attack was possible. The torpedo reliability problems that plagued the German submarine service in the first years of the war were a source of frustration felt from the lowest ranks to the highest command levels. A captain could do everything correctly, close to ideal range, calculate an accurate solution, fire at the right moment, and still watch his weapon pass harmlessly beneath a target, or detonate against nothing at all, or simply fail to run. Bleichrodt experienced this, as virtually every U-boat commander of the period did, and the lesson he drew was not despair, but recalibration. He adjusted his firing ranges, modified his angle approaches, and stored his frustrations where they would not leak into his crew's confidence. The interaction between U-boat commanders was another dimension of learning that cannot be understated. At bases along the French coast, men who had just returned from patrol compared notes with those about to depart. The debrief culture within the U-boat arm was genuinely rigorous. Dönitz himself was known for conducting post-patrol interviews with returning commanders, probing tactical decisions, asking why certain choices had been made, occasionally expressing disagreement in terms that left no room for ambiguity. Bleichrodt attended these sessions and participated in the informal conversations that surrounded them, absorbing tactical thought from men who had been hunting Allied shipping since the first day of the war. This was an officer corps that, in these early years, still believed deeply in what it was doing and shared knowledge with the energy of professionals convinced they were winning. Beneath the tactical development, something quieter was happening to Bleichrodt during this period. The sea has a long tradition of reshaping the people who commit themselves to it, and submarine service amplifies this process considerably. A man who spends weeks in an enclosed space, subject to the same rhythms of tension and release as every other man aboard, is changed by the experience in ways that persist long after he has returned to land. Bleichrodt appears to have emerged from his early patrols with a deepened reticence, not unfriendliness, but a quality of interior attention that those who knew him remarked upon. He was a man who had learned to think beneath the surface, in more than one sense of the phrase. He had also learned something harder to articulate, the particular moral texture of the hunt itself. A submarine commander pursues a target for hours or days, builds a relationship with it through the periscope and the plotting table, and then destroys it in a matter of minutes. The target is not, in the abstract, a collection of steel plates and cargo. It is men, it is livelihoods, it is supply chains that sustain populations. Bleichrodt, like every effective predator in any conflict, needed to hold this knowledge at a certain distance in order to function. Whether he succeeded in that separation, and at what cost, is something the historical record does not fully illuminate. What it does show is that he continued to patrol, continued to engage, and continued to develop as a commander throughout this period, which suggests he found a way, as most men in his position did, to set aside the weight of what the hunt actually meant. By the time U-48 had completed several patrols under his command, Bleichrodt had become something recognizably different from the officer who had first taken the boat out of harbor. He was more economical in his orders, more confident in his silences, more attuned to the minute variations of pressure, atmospheric, mechanical, human, that determined whether a patrol ended in success or disaster. The fleet was still performing well at this stage of the war, still accumulating tonnage at a rate that gave German naval command reason for optimism, and Bleichrodt's name was beginning to appear with regularity in the assessments that passed between commanders. Not yet celebrated, not yet decorated, but noticed. There is a particular moment in a military career when a man transitions from promising to proven, and Bleichrodt was approaching that threshold with every hour spent beneath the Atlantic waves. The ocean does not offer examinations with grades or ceremonies with witnesses. It offers only the next patrol, the next contact, the next sequence of decisions made under conditions that tolerate no revision. Bleichrodt accepted this bargain. He had understood from his earliest days at sea that the water asks only for competence and attention, and rewards both with survival. Everything else, reputation, recognition, the assessments of superiors and historians alike, follows from that basic transaction, or it does not come at all. He was becoming, in the most precise sense of the word, a hunter, not through temperament alone, but through accumulated experience, deliberate study, and the slow accumulation of judgment that no training program can manufacture and no order from above can compel. It had to be earned, watch by watch and patrol by patrol, in the cold dark beneath the North Atlantic, and he was earning it. Spring came early to the North Sea in 1940, but there was nothing gentle about it. The waters off the Norwegian coast ran grey and cold, churned by winds that swept down from the Arctic without apology. For the crews of the German U-boat fleet, this was not a season of renewal. It was the opening of a new and far more complex chapter in a war that had already consumed one winter's worth of blood and iron. The campaign to seize Norway and Denmark, designated Operation Weserübung, was among the most audacious military enterprises Germany had yet attempted. It required the simultaneous projection of naval, air, and ground forces across hundreds of kilometers of open, contested water against a nation that had done nothing to provoke it. For the U-boats assigned to support the operation, it meant operating in waters that were shallow, treacherous, and increasingly patrolled by a Royal Navy that had every reason to contest the invasion with everything it had. Heinrich Bleichrodt brought U-48 into these waters, carrying the weight of his earlier patrols behind him, not as a burden, but as a kind of ballast. The lessons of the preceding months had settled into his understanding of submarine warfare the way salt settles into timber, quietly, thoroughly, and with lasting effect. He was no longer the officer absorbing instructions from the bridge of another man's boat. He was the commander, responsible for the vessel, the crew, and every decision made in the moments when decisions could not wait. The Norwegian campaign would test that responsibility in ways that differed substantially from the merchant war patrols he had run in the Atlantic approaches. Here the targets were not only cargo ships plodding between convoy lanes. Here the Royal Navy itself was present in force, hunting with aggressive purpose, fully aware that German surface ships were attempting something that most naval observers would have called reckless. The operational picture for U-boats during Weserübung was complicated from the outset. Dönitz had positioned his submarines in a series of patrol zones designed to intercept British naval forces attempting to interfere with the German landings. But the coordination between submarine operations and the surface fleet proved far more difficult than planners had anticipated. The shallow waters of the fjords and coastal approaches created constant navigational hazards. The acoustic conditions made sound ranging unreliable. Mines, both German and British, lurked without regard for nationality. And the presence of so many vessels of so many types, German transports, British destroyers, neutral Norwegian ships caught in the middle, created a fog of operational uncertainty that tested the judgment of every commander in the field. Bleichrodt navigated this fog with the methodical caution that was already becoming his signature, pressing forward when conditions permitted, and pulling back when pressing forward would have been indistinguishable from suicide. What distinguished the Norwegian campaign from his earlier Atlantic patrols was the density of military activity around him. In the Atlantic, a patrol might pass for days without sighting another vessel. Here, the sea was crowded with consequence. British heavy units were operating in Norwegian waters, cruisers, destroyers, and elements of the home fleet deploying in response to the German invasion. These were not the lumbering silhouettes of merchant vessels maintaining predictable courses at modest speeds. These were warships built for evasion and counterattack, capable of turning the hunter into the hunted in a matter of minutes. Engaging them required a quality of decision-making that went beyond the mechanics of firing solutions and torpedo spreads. It required the ability to read a tactical situation at depth, with incomplete information, against a moving target that might at any moment detect the attack and begin prosecuting a counterattack of its own. There were engagements during this period in which U-48 made contact with British naval forces, and the experience of those contacts forged something in Bleichrodt that mere training could never have produced. The moment of commitment, the point at which a commander decides that the attack will go forward, that the tube doors will open and the torpedoes will run, carries a weight that multiplies enormously when the target has the means to respond with lethal force. Bleichrodt felt that weight and did not flinch from it. His crew observed this in him, and their confidence in his judgment grew accordingly. Aboard a submarine, the relationship between commander and crew is unusually intimate. There is nowhere to hide from poor decisions, and no performance that can mask genuine uncertainty. What Bleichrodt demonstrated in the waters off Norway was a composure that read as settled authority rather than performed bravado. The torpedoes themselves became a source of deep frustration during the Norwegian campaign, and not only for Bleichrodt. A significant number of attacks made by German U-boats during this period failed to produce detonations, despite approaches that should by all calculation have resulted in hits. The German magnetic pistol fusing system, designed to detonate a warhead beneath a ship's keel, where the hull was most vulnerable, proved chronically unreliable in the high-latitude waters of the Norwegian Sea. The local variations in the Earth's magnetic field interfered with the fusing mechanism in ways that had not been anticipated during design and testing. Torpedo after torpedo ran true to its target and passed beneath the keel in silence, or struck the hull and failed to explode. For a commander risking his boat and crew to close to attacking range against armed warships, such failures were not merely frustrating, they were professionally corrosive. The sense that the equipment trusted with one's life was failing at the critical moment required a particular kind of steadiness to absorb and continue. Dönitz's own assessment of the Norwegian campaign's torpedo failures was furious, and he made his anger known through official channels with a directness that left no one uncertain of his view. Bleichrodt shared that anger, but did not allow it to curdle into paralysis. He adapted his approach, shifting toward contact detonation settings where possible, adjusting his depth calculations, refining his estimation of optimal attack parameters under conditions that the manuals had not fully accounted for. This capacity for in-field adaptation, driven by operational reality rather than theoretical preference, was one of the qualities that would define his development as a commander. He was learning not from textbooks, but from the sea itself, and the sea was a demanding and unforgiving instructor. Away from the tactical immediacies, the Norwegian campaign was unfolding at a strategic level with a momentum that astonished the world. German forces were seizing ports and airfields across Norway at a pace that left the Allied response perpetually one step behind. The Royal Navy fought hard. It lost ships, inflicted losses on German surface forces, and demonstrated that contesting these waters was not a matter of token resistance. But the speed and coordination of the German operation gave the Allies insufficient time to consolidate a counter-effort that could have reversed the outcome on land. By the time British and French ground forces landed at several points along the Norwegian coast, the strategic initiative had already shifted firmly to Germany. For the U-boats operating in support of the campaign, this broad strategic success represented validation of their role, even if the tactical record of individual submarines was mixed. Bleichrodt emerged from the Norwegian campaign with something valuable that could not be tallied in tonnage figures or confirmed kills. He emerged with a tested understanding of what submarine warfare in contested, operationally complex environments actually demanded. The Atlantic Merchant War had taught him the mechanics of the hunt, the patience, the approach, the firing solution, the withdrawal. Norway had taught him something harder to define and more difficult to teach, the management of ambiguity under sustained pressure. When the picture was unclear and the stakes were immediate, when the equipment might fail and the enemy might be closer than the sensors suggested, when the right choice was not the obvious choice, this was the environment in which command character either developed or broke. Bleichrodt's character had developed. His relationship with his crew deepened during this period, in ways that would sustain the boat through the harder patrols ahead. The men of U-48 were not interchangeable components of a mechanical system. They were individuals who had chosen to serve in the most claustrophobic and morally demanding environment that modern warfare had yet devised, sealed inside a metal tube beneath the ocean, entirely dependent on each other and on the judgment of the man who commanded them. Trust between a U-boat commander and his crew was not a given. It was earned through demonstrated competence and shared hardship, built slowly in the quiet hours between encounters, and confirmed rapidly in the violent seconds of an attack or a depth charging. Bleichrodt had earned that trust by the time Norway's fjords receded behind the stern of U-48. When the campaign ended and the boat returned to base, the broader conversation among U-boat commanders was one of mixed assessment. The Norwegian operation had exposed significant vulnerabilities in equipment, in coordination, in the limitations of submarine warfare when operating in confined and heavily contested waters. But it had also confirmed something that Dönitz believed deeply, that well-commanded submarines, crewed by trained men, could operate effectively in the most demanding environments the war could produce. Not without loss, not without failure, but effectively enough to matter. Bleichrodt was part of the generation of commanders that Dönitz needed to prove his doctrine, and Norway had provided a proving ground more rigorous than any peacetime exercise could have replicated. The war was still, in the spring of 1940, a relatively young thing. France had not yet fallen. The vast campaign in the open Atlantic that would define the U-boat war in the public consciousness was still to come. But for Bleichrodt, something had already shifted. The officer who had brought U-48 into Norwegian waters in the early weeks of the campaign was a capable man growing into command. The officer who brought her home was something more precise. A commander who had been tested by conditions that exceeded his training, had found within himself the resources to meet those conditions, and had brought his crew through intact. That transformation, quiet and undramatic as transformations in wartime often are, was the true significance of the Norwegian campaign for Heinrich Bleichrodt. The Atlantic was waiting. He was ready. Chapter 7. The Atlantic opens. In the spring of 1940, Europe witnessed a transformation that would reshape the entire character of naval warfare. The German Wehrmacht's conquest of France, swift, devastating, and seemingly irreversible, handed Adolf Hitler something he had long coveted, a string of Atlantic ports from which submarines could operate with unprecedented reach and freedom. The fall of France meant that U-boats no longer needed to traverse the entire North Sea and navigate through the English Channel to access the open ocean. Instead, they could slip out from bases at Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, and Brest, emerging into the vast Atlantic within hours rather than days. For Heinrich Bleichrodt and his crew aboard U-48, this shift opened a new chapter of possibility. The claustrophobic warfare of the North Sea and the English Channel gave way to something far vaster and, in many ways, far more consequential. The hunting ground had expanded from a circumscribed theatre to an ocean measured in thousands of kilometers. It was a transition that would define the middle years of his command and establish his reputation among the U-boat officer corps. The logistics of this expansion cannot be overstated. The captured French ports became not merely departure points, but entirely new operational ecosystems. The Germans swiftly occupied these bases and began constructing massive concrete U-boat pens, fortified shelters capable of protecting submarines from air attack. Supply lines materialized from Germany's industrial heartland, delivering fuel, torpedoes, provisions, and spare parts. Repair facilities were established. Training grounds were designated for new crews arriving from Germany. The atmosphere in these ports was one of purpose and momentum. Officers and men understood, perhaps for the first time, that they possessed the infrastructure necessary to wage war across an ocean. Bleichrodt, now in his second year of commanding U-48, found himself in an environment of rapid expansion and increasing expectation. The novelty of operating from French territory was accompanied by the weight of new responsibility. The U-boat arm was transforming from a peripheral force into what many officers, and surely the leadership under Karl Dönitz, believed could become a war-winning weapon. The Atlantic in 1940 was a killing ground barely regulated by effective Allied defence. British merchant vessels, the lifeblood of the island nation's survival, traversed the ocean in increasing numbers, carrying supplies from America and the Dominions. These ships travelled in convoys, theoretically protected by escorts, yet the sheer vastness of the Atlantic and the relative scarcity of Allied naval vessels meant that gaps existed. Patrol planes were few and their range limited. Radar, which would eventually become a devastating counter to submarine operations, was still in its infancy and not widely distributed. The United States, though officially neutral, was already supplying Britain with war materiel, but America herself would not enter the war until December 1941. Consequently, the waters west of the British Isles represented a frontier of opportunity. Bleichrodt understood this perfectly. As he prepared U-48 for patrols operating from the French coast, he recognized that the tactical situation had fundamentally altered in Germany's favor. The mathematics of submarine warfare suddenly looked promising. If U-boats could intercept convoys at sea and attack with relative impunity, the cumulative tonnage sunk could theoretically cripple British ability to sustain herself. Dönitz himself had articulated this logic with characteristic clarity. The German admiral believed that Germany could win the war through an attrition campaign against British shipping. If the tonnage of merchant vessels sunk exceeded the tonnage that Britain and her allies could construct or replace, the island nation would be strangled economically and militarily. It was a strategy that demanded high operational tempos, skilled commanders, and sufficient submarine numbers to maintain continuous pressure across the Atlantic. Bleichrodt, as a commanding officer, was part of this grand strategic vision, though his immediate concerns were far more concrete: identifying targets, positioning his U-boat to intercept them, attacking without suffering catastrophic damage, and returning safely to port. The ideology of National Socialism mattered less to him in these moments than the practical challenges of submarine command. Yet he existed within a system organized entirely around the prosecution of this war, and his competence as a hunter directly served the state's objectives. It was a paradox that many officers faced but rarely articulated. They were professionals executing their duties within an immoral regime, and the distinction, however important morally, provided little operational comfort. The first patrols from the French bases were exhilarating and profitable. Bleichrodt, commanding a relatively modern U-boat with an experienced crew, demonstrated an aptitude for the hunt that had been developing steadily since his first command patrol 2 years earlier. The crew of U-48 had learned his methods and expectations. They understood his management style, which combined professional discipline with a respect for the practical wisdom accumulated through actual operations. Submarine command demanded that officers trust their men in confined spaces where panic could prove fatal. Bleichrodt had cultivated that trust through consistency and demonstrated competence. When he ordered the submarine to shallow depths to stalk a convoy, or when he maneuvered to attack from a position of advantage, his men executed those orders with confidence that their commander knew what he was doing. The results of these Atlantic patrols began to accumulate. Merchant vessels were sighted, approached, and attacked. Some were sunk, others were damaged or forced to disperse from their convoys. The tonnage mounted. Bleichrodt's name began to appear in the operational summaries, distributed among the U-boat officer corps, and recognition among one's peers carried weight in the competitive hierarchy of submarine command. The tactical environment in which Bleichrodt operated began to reveal patterns. Convoys followed certain routes, constrained by the need to reach specific destinations and by the desire to remain within areas where escort coverage existed. The Germans developed intelligence about these routes through various sources: naval intercepts, agent reports, and accumulated operational knowledge. U-Boat Command, under Dönitz, used this intelligence to position submarines to intercept convoys before they could reach protected waters. The tactics that emerged from this operational reality came to be known as the Wolf Pack system. Rather than operating individually, U-boats would coordinate attacks on the same convoy, overwhelming the escort vessels through sheer numbers and concentrated firepower. Bleichrodt participated in several of these coordinated operations as U-48 operated from the French coast. The coordination required radio communication, which created vulnerability to detection, but the tactical advantage of concentrating force against merchant convoys was immense. A single U-boat attacking a convoy faced the entire escort group's defensive fire. Multiple U-boats attacking simultaneously scattered the defenders and allowed individual submarines to select targets and attack under relatively favorable conditions. These operations were not without cost or danger. The expanding British escort forces, though still thin, fought aggressively. Depth charges, dropped or fired from escort vessels, created shock waves that could crack a submarine's hull or jam critical mechanical systems. Bleichrodt experienced several encounters with escort vessels that forced U-48 to dive to extreme depths, endure hours of depth charging, and navigate carefully out of the attack zone while maintaining silence and minimal noise. These were moments of genuine terror for the crew. A submarine's strength lay in its ability to submerge and hide. If detected, it became a sitting target in an environment where escape was limited. The acoustic environment of the deep ocean could mask the sound of approaching depth charges until they were nearly upon you. Bleichrodt developed a reputation for calm under these circumstances, for making decisions about which depths to maintain, when to move, and how to position the U-boat to evade pursuing escorts. His survival rate, the proportion of patrols he completed successfully with his boat intact, was notably high, which itself enhanced his reputation among fellow commanding officers who understood intimately what that meant. By 1941, the Atlantic operations from the French bases had become established routine, though routine is perhaps a misleading term for an activity that regularly exposed men to mortal danger. U-48 operated on patrol cycles, depart from port with full fuel tanks and weapons, transit to the designated operational area, conduct patrols lasting several weeks, engage targets as circumstances permitted, and eventually return to port for resupply and crew rest. Each cycle might last 8 to 10 weeks from departure to return. During that time, the crew lived in conditions of extreme confinement, breathing recycled air, consuming canned provisions, and maintaining constant vigilance for threats. The psychological toll of submarine service was substantial and widely recognized within the German Navy. Officers understood that men could endure only so many patrols before the cumulative stress of the environment and the knowledge of danger began to degrade performance. Bleichrodt managed this tension by maintaining discipline while also ensuring that his crew received adequate rest periods between patrols. A command was only as effective as the men who operated it, and keeping that crew functional was a commander's responsibility. The accumulation of tonnage sunk by Bleichrodt and U-48 during this period established his standing within the U-boat arm. By the middle of 1941, he had become one of the recognized successful commanders. He was selected for increased responsibility and consideration for future advancement. The competitive nature of the submarine officer corps meant that successful patrols and high-tonnage figures were currency in this professional hierarchy. Men who achieved results earned respect from their peers, selection for better boats, and recognition from senior leadership. Bleichrodt's transformation from a competent but relatively junior officer into a commander of note took place during these Atlantic patrols. He was, in the estimation of his peers and superiors, a skilled hunter who understood submarine warfare, who could manage a crew effectively, and who could return results without taking unnecessary risks that would get his men killed unnecessarily. These qualities were relatively rare among U-boat commanders, many of whom were aggressive to the point of recklessness or overly cautious to the point of ineffectiveness. The broader strategic context was shifting, however, even as Bleichrodt achieved operational success. The Battle of the Atlantic, as it came to be known, was intensifying. British countermeasures were improving steadily. Convoy escort groups were becoming more numerous and better trained. Radar detection systems, initially experimental, were beginning to appear on escort vessels. Radio direction finding equipment was being deployed to locate U-boats operating on the surface at night. The Americans, though not yet officially in the war, were increasingly providing assistance to British naval forces, including escort vessels and surveillance capabilities. These developments were not yet catastrophic for the U-boat arm in 1941, but the trajectory was clear to experienced observers. The window of German tactical advantage that had opened with the conquest of France was beginning to close. The advantage was not yet lost. Many of the most successful U-boat patrols occurred during 1941 and 1942. But the direction of change was unmistakable. Bleichrodt, conducting patrols during this transition period, was operating at what would prove to be the high water mark of German submarine advantage. He did not know this, of course, but the more perceptive officers in the U-boat service were beginning to sense that the favorable conditions would not persist indefinitely. The personal dimension of Bleichrodt's success during this period deserves recognition as well. Command of a U-boat was not merely a technical exercise. It required an understanding of human psychology, the ability to make life and death decisions under extreme stress, and the capacity to maintain confidence in oneself when objective circumstances might suggest pessimism. Bleichrodt appears to have possessed these qualities in combination with solid technical competence and operational judgment. His crew respected him, which is evident in the records of those who served under him. He maintained discipline without excessive harshness. He made decisions that balanced aggressive pursuit of targets against the preservation of his boat and crew. These are the qualities that distinguished successful U-boat commanders from those who were merely competent or merely aggressive. Bleichrodt's operational success from the French bases during this middle period of the war established the foundation of his reputation as one of the more capable officers in the submarine service. The Atlantic had opened, vast and seemingly full of opportunity, and Bleichrodt had proven himself capable of exploiting the tactical advantages that this new phase of naval warfare offered. The year 1941 marked a subtle but irreversible shift in the war beneath the Atlantic waves. What had begun as a series of profitable hunts, where a U-boat commander with skill and nerve could accumulate tonnage with relative regularity, now began to transform into something far more dangerous and unpredictable. The British, having survived the initial shock of the German assault on their merchant fleet, were learning. They were adapting. They were beginning to understand that victory against the submarines would not come through the courage of individual ships or crews, but through systematic methods, coordinated response, and technology applied with ruthless precision. Bleichrodt, commanding U-48, would find himself navigating not just the physical dangers of submarine warfare, but a widening gap between the tactics that had served him well and the emerging realities of an enemy that refused to remain vulnerable. In the opening months of 1941, the British convoy system had become increasingly organized. What had once been scattered merchant vessels attempting to cross the Atlantic individually now moved in coordinated groups, escorted by destroyers, corvettes, and smaller warships whose sole purpose was to protect them. These escort groups represented a complete inversion of the tactical environment that had favored the German U-boats in the previous 2 years. The submarines could no longer simply loiter on major shipping routes and select targets at leisure. Instead, they faced organized, armed opposition that remained constantly alert. Bleichrodt understood the mathematics of this shift immediately. A U-boat attacking a convoy faced not one merchant ship, but potentially dozens, all of them shielded by warships equipped with weapons designed specifically to hunt submarines. The risk-to-reward calculation that had previously favored aggressive action now required far more careful consideration. Depth charges had evolved too. These simple explosive barrels that had been dropped from escort vessels in the early war years had become more refined, more numerous, and far more lethal in their deployment. The British were learning where to station them, how to coordinate their patterns, and how to use listening devices to track the movement of submarines beneath the surface. Bleichrodt had experienced depth charge attacks before. They were part of the hazard of the profession, but the frequency and sophistication of these assaults was increasing with every patrol. A single depth charge near a submarine created a shock wave that could rupture the pressure hull and send a boat and its crew to the bottom of the ocean in minutes. Multiple depth charges, coordinated by experienced escort captains, transformed the underwater environment into something that resembled a hunting ground, where the hunter had suddenly become the hunted. The crews of U-48 grew accustomed to the sound, the distant thud that grew louder, the shudder of the boat, the groaning of metal stressed beyond its design specifications, the desperate hope that the explosion would be far enough away. But depth charges, dangerous as they were, represented only part of the British response to the U-boat threat. A far more insidious development was emerging in the form of radar technology. The British had begun equipping their escort vessels with primitive radar sets that could detect the presence of a submarine on the surface at distances that far exceeded the range of human sight. This represented a fundamental challenge to the fundamental nature of submarine warfare as it had been practiced up to this point. U-boats operated most effectively when they could remain undetected, approaching convoys on the surface where their diesel engines gave them superior speed and mobility compared to the slower merchant vessels. This superiority depended entirely on surprise. If the escort vessels could detect them before they got within firing range, the entire advantage evaporated. Bleichrodt, like other U-boat commanders, suddenly found himself facing the possibility that his boat could be spotted at night or in fog, situations that had previously offered perfect concealment, by an enemy he could not see and could not locate in return. The psychological impact of this development rippled through the U-boat arm. It introduced a new source of fear, the possibility that the boat might be under attack from an enemy position that remained invisible and incomprehensible. The mounting losses throughout the U-boat fleet during 1941 served as a constant reminder of the shifting balance. What had been the celebrated arm of German naval power, the force that had sunk millions of tons of British shipping and inspired fear among merchant crews, was beginning to suffer catastrophic casualties of its own. U-boats that had conducted successful patrols and returned to their bases now began to fail to return at all. Sometimes other U-boats reported seeing them destroyed. More often, they simply disappeared, their fates unknowable to those who had trained with them, served with them, and expected to meet them again in port. Each loss meant the death of roughly 50 men, officers, experienced petty officers, and young sailors who had been drafted into the submarine service because of the Kriegsmarine's manpower requirements. The boat that Bleichrodt commanded carried approximately 48 souls. The crews of U-boats across the fleet understood these numbers in visceral terms. They saw the empty bunks, the replacement crews arriving to fill the gaps, the memorial services held in the bases in France and Germany. The golden age of the U-boat arm was transitioning into something far more grim. Bleichrodt's response to these changing circumstances revealed the qualities that had made him a successful commander. Rather than following the rigid tactical doctrines that had worked in previous years, he began experimenting with new approaches. He learned to approach convoys with greater caution, to conduct thorough reconnaissance before committing to an attack, to break off engagements when the tactical situation favored the escort vessels rather than continuing to press an assault. He became more conservative with his boat and his crew, understanding that while aggressive tactics might yield successful sinkings, the increased likelihood of loss now weighted heavily against such approaches. This represented an evolution in the mindset of the U-boat commander. The earliest generation of submariners had often viewed patrol as a competitive enterprise, a chance to accumulate tonnage, to earn decorations, to achieve fame within the submarine service. Bleichrodt was beginning to understand that survival itself was becoming an acceptable outcome. To return from patrol having sunk nothing but having kept the boat and crew intact was increasingly viewed as a successful mission rather than a failure. The technical condition of U-48 itself reflected the broader challenges facing the U-boat arm by 1941. The boat was now 3 years old, a considerable age for a submarine engaged in regular combat operations. Her engines required increasingly frequent maintenance. Her hull, stressed by repeated depth charging and the stresses of underwater operations, showed signs of cumulative wear. Fresh crew members arriving from training schools found themselves serving in a boat that was becoming less reliable with each patrol. Diesel fuel, which had once been readily available, was beginning to face supply constraints as German industry struggled with the demands of multiple fronts. Spare parts became harder to obtain. The bases in France, while offering advantages over the earlier North Sea departure points, were increasingly exposed to British air attacks and intelligence operations. Bleichrodt had to manage not only the tactical demands of patrol, but also the practical reality that his boat was aging and that the infrastructure supporting the U-boat arm was under growing strain. The psychological impact of these developments should not be understated. Submarine service had always demanded courage and a willingness to accept danger in service of Germany's naval objectives. But the nature of that danger was changing in ways that made it harder to rationalize or accept. In the earlier, more successful period of U-boat operations, commanders could view their service as part of a strategy that appeared to be working. Tonnage sunk was exceeding replacements built, and the prospect of strangling British commerce and forcing a British surrender seemed at least plausible. By 1941, no such illusions could be maintained. The trend lines were moving in the wrong direction. More U-boats were being sunk than could be replaced, even with the expansion of building programs. The British merchant fleet was being reinforced by American construction, even though the United States was not yet formally at war with Germany. The promise that the U-boat arm would achieve strategic victory was beginning to ring hollow in the ears of men who understood the mathematics of attrition. What had been presented as a temporary period of danger the time it would take for the U-boats to defeat Britain was extending into an indefinite future with no clear endpoint. Bleichrodt's patrols during this period show a commander learning to operate in a new reality. Where his earlier patrols had often resulted in multiple sinkings, his operations in 1941 began to show lower tonnage accumulation per patrol, despite comparable time at sea. This was not a failure of technique or courage, but rather a reflection of the simple fact that fewer opportunities presented themselves. Convoys that could be approached and attacked with confidence in earlier periods now represented significant risks. The choice to attack a convoy escorted by alert warships equipped with new detection technologies was a decision that required careful calculation. Bleichrodt and his crew found themselves spending long periods on patrol with little to show for their efforts, a dramatic shift from the commercial success that had characterized earlier operations. The frustration this produced was not merely about personal achievement or career advancement, but about the fundamental purpose of their mission. They had been sent to sea to sink ships, to wage economic warfare against Britain, to contribute to Germany's strategic objective. Now they were being asked to accomplish this against a defending force that was growing stronger, more competent, and more lethal with each passing month. The relationship between individual commanders and the German Naval High Command underwent a subtle shift during this period. Early in the war, commanders who demonstrated aggressive tactics and accumulated high-tonnage figures were celebrated, promoted, and held up as examples to others. The U-boat arm had developed something approaching a cult of personality around its most successful captains. But by 1941, the calculus was beginning to shift. A commander who brought his boat home safely, who managed his crew effectively, and who used good judgment in tactical decisions began to be viewed more favorably than one who pursued aggressive attacks regardless of risk. This represented a shift from a strategy that emphasized the aggressive employment of submarines to one that was beginning to recognize the necessity of preserving force strength for a prolonged conflict. It was a subtle change, but Bleichrodt, a thoughtful and observant officer, would have recognized its implications. The war that had been expected to be decided within the first few years was now taking on the character of a prolonged struggle, and the tactics and command philosophies that had worked in a short war would need to adapt to the requirements of endurance. The broader context of 1941 adds additional weight to the tactical and technical challenges facing U-boat commanders. Germany had invaded the Soviet Union in June of that year, opening a massive new front that would consume enormous resources and attention. The German Naval High Command, already engaged in a struggle with British naval forces in the Atlantic and Mediterranean, now found itself forced to allocate resources to support operations thousands of kilometers away on land. The U-boat arm, despite its significant achievements in sinking merchant tonnage, was beginning to be viewed as secondary to the titanic struggle on land. This reallocation of priority meant fewer new submarines being built, reduced allocation of fuel and supplies, and a general sense that the submarine service was not receiving the attention and resources that had characterized the opening period of the war. Bleichrodt, commanding his boat somewhere in the Atlantic during long patrols, would have been aware of these strategic shifts primarily through the operational orders he received and the tangible reductions in support his boat experienced. The year 1941 also marked a period when the human cost of the war was becoming increasingly apparent to German officers with access to reliable information. The early optimism about German victory had been grounded, to some extent, in the assumption that the conflict would be resolved quickly. The invasion of France in 1940 and its rapid success had seemed to validate this assumption. But the British refusal to surrender, the American provision of materiel to Britain, the apparent determination of the Soviet Union to continue fighting despite catastrophic initial losses, these developments created a growing sense of unease among military professionals who understood the limitations of German resources. Bleichrodt, educated, observant, and responsible for the lives of approximately 48 men, would have been aware that the strategic situation was not developing according to the original German conception of how the war would unfold. The turning tide he experienced in 1941 was not a sudden reversal, but rather a growing recognition that the advantages that had characterized the early period of the U-Boat War were diminishing, and that the conflict was evolving in ways that did not favor prolonged German resistance. By the end of 1941, Bleichrodt had accumulated an impressive record: multiple successful patrols, significant tonnage sunk, respect among his fellow officers, and the trust of his crew. But he had also experienced firsthand the transformation of the U-Boat War from an operation of relative tactical freedom to one of increasing constraint and danger. The British convoy system had become more sophisticated, more numerous, and more heavily escorted. Depth charges were more plentiful and more effectively deployed. Radar was entering the tactical equation, introducing an entirely new dimension of uncertainty. The losses across the U-boat fleet were mounting, and the replacement rate for both boats and experienced crews was failing to keep pace. Most fundamentally, the overall strategic situation facing Germany was becoming increasingly difficult. These were not abstract developments but realities that Bleichrodt had to confront on every patrol. They were written in the stress marks on the hull of his boat, in the exhaustion of his crew after weeks at sea, in the increasing difficulty of finding undefended targets, and in the growing certainty that the war that had seemed so promising in 1940 was evolving into something far more prolonged and uncertain. The turning tide that Bleichrodt witnessed in 1941 would define the remainder of his service in the U-boat arm. The machinery of war operates according to its own logic, and in 1942, that logic demanded change. Heinrich Bleichrodt had served with distinction aboard U-48, accumulating tonnage and experience in equal measure, but the Atlantic was becoming a harder ocean. The wolf pack tactics that had once brought spectacular success were now meeting increasingly sophisticated resistance. Convoy escorts had grown more numerous, their weapons more effective, their tactics more coordinated. The British and Americans were learning to fight beneath the waves with a competence that had not existed 2 years earlier. For a commander of Bleichrodt's proven ability, this created both a problem and an opportunity. The German naval command under Admiral Karl Dönitz understood that the future of submarine warfare lay not in the crowded waters of the North Atlantic alone, but in distant oceans where Allied escort vessels were spread thin and radar coverage remained incomplete. Strategic thinking dictated that U-boat operations should expand into the Indian Ocean and other distant theaters, where merchant shipping moved with less protection and the element of surprise could still be leveraged to devastating effect. These operations required vessels with greater range, larger fuel capacity, and the ability to remain submerged for extended periods under demanding conditions. The Type XC U-boat represented the pinnacle of German submarine technology available at that time. Larger than the Type Vic boats that formed the backbone of the fleet, the Type 1XC could carry more supplies, travel greater distances, and operate with a degree of autonomy that smaller boats could never achieve. When the command structure decided to assign a proven ace to captain one of these valuable vessels on distant patrols, the choice fell to Bleichrodt. The transfer itself represented recognition. U-48 had served Bleichrodt well, but she was bound for repair and refit that would take months. Other younger commanders were ready to take her over and make their own reputations in the North Atlantic. U-109, by contrast, represented advancement. The boat had already seen action under previous commanders, and while her record was respectable, she had not yet encountered a captain with Bleichrodt's combination of caution and aggression, his gift for reading both the sea and the behavior of merchant captains. The handover from one commanding officer to the next involved not merely administrative formality, but a deep understanding of the vessel's characteristics, her quirks, her strengths, and her weaknesses. Bleichrodt spent weeks learning U-109 as thoroughly as one might come to know another living creature. He studied her engine configurations, her diving patterns, the particular resonance of her hull under different conditions, the way her crew had learned to work together under her previous captain. The crew itself represented another form of transition. Some men had served with Bleichrodt aboard U-48 and transferred with him, bringing continuity and experience. Others were new to his command, young sailors and engineers who had trained in the expanding submarine service and brought with them the latest doctrinal understanding of their roles. The synthesis of these groups did not happen automatically. A submarine is perhaps the most intimately coordinated fighting unit in modern warfare, where the actions of any individual crew member in any compartment can mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Bleichrodt understood that building trust among these men, establishing patterns of communication and decision-making that would function under stress, required time and deliberate effort. In the months before U-109 would be ready for her first operational patrol under his command, Bleichrodt conducted numerous training exercises, drills in darkness, simulations of combat scenarios, and endless repetition of procedures until they became automatic responses rather than conscious thought. The strategic context of his new posting carried significance that reached far beyond the personal advancement of one officer. By 1942, the German Navy had suffered repeated setbacks in the North Atlantic. The sinking of the Bismarck in 1941 had revealed the limits of surface warfare, and the German surface fleet was essentially confined to port, waiting and consuming resources while achieving little. The U-boat fleet had become the primary instrument through which Germany could contest Allied naval dominance. Dönitz increasingly viewed distant water operations as a way to maintain German pressure on British supply lines and the American industrial effort without directly engaging the concentrated escort forces that had made the Central Atlantic progressively more lethal. The Indian Ocean offered tantalizing possibilities. Japan was Germany's ally in the Far East, and there existed theoretical opportunities for German and Japanese submarines to coordinate operations against British shipping. The waters around the Cape of Good Hope saw constant traffic from the Middle East and from India and beyond, carrying rubber, oil, and other strategic materials essential to the Allied war effort. A single successful U-boat commander operating in these distant waters could disrupt shipping routes that had for years carried supplies with minimal opposition. Yet the distance itself presented formidable challenges. The voyage from German-controlled bases to the Indian Ocean via the Cape of Good Hope represented a journey of nearly 8,000 nautical miles. U-109 would need to travel submerged through waters where enemy surface forces might appear with minimal warning. She would need to avoid air patrols, to maintain mechanical integrity under conditions of extreme stress, and to navigate through hostile waters without resupply or rescue options. The boat would carry fuel for an extended mission, but this meant less space for supplies and ammunition. The crew would endure confined quarters for months without setting foot on land. The psychological and physical strain of such an undertaking could not be underestimated. Men could grow ill, relationships could become frayed, and mechanical failures could become death sentences in waters so far from any possibility of assistance. Bleichrodt approached this posting with the clarity of understanding that this was not merely an operational assignment, but a test of his leadership, his judgment, and his capacity to sustain a crew under conditions of unprecedented isolation and stress. The preparation for such an operation involved meticulous planning at every level. Dönitz's staff calculated routes designed to minimize exposure to known Allied patrol areas. Supply calculations had to account for every conceivable requirement, from food to replacement parts to medical supplies. The crew received extensive briefing on the waters they would encounter, the types of shipping they would likely encounter, and the tactical approaches that had proven successful against merchant vessels in distant oceans. Bleichrodt studied reports from other U-boat commanders who had attempted similar operations, learning from their successes and their failures. He absorbed information about prevailing winds, currents, seasonal weather patterns, and the likely behavior of merchant captains operating so far from concentrated escort protection. This was not mere academic study. The information might mean the difference between achieving tonnage and wasting fuel, between encountering an armed merchant cruiser and sinking an undefended freighter, between reaching the Indian Ocean or being forced to abandon the mission and return to base. The Type 1XC boat itself embodied the evolution of German submarine design, where the Type Vic represented balance between range and maneuverability. The Type 1XC prioritized extended range and cargo capacity. The boat displaced more than 1,000 tons submerged, making her substantially larger than the smaller Type 7 boats. Her two diesel engines could drive her at speeds approaching 20 knots on the surface, while her electric batteries allowed for more silent underwater operation than the smaller boats. She carried more torpedoes, more ammunition for her deck gun, and more supplies for sustaining her crew. The larger hull provided more space, which in the context of submarine operations meant the difference between men existing in claustrophobic proximity and having slightly more room to move, to work, to sleep in shifts on bunks that never remained unoccupied. These seemingly minor considerations could accumulate throughout a months-long patrol into factors that affected crew morale and effectiveness. Bleichrodt's command of U-109 represented the beginning of what would become his most successful period as a U-boat commander. The combination of his accumulated experience, his proven tactical skills, his understanding of merchant ship behavior and the psychology of their crews, and the capabilities of the Type 1XC boat created a powerful synthesis. Yet as he prepared to take this larger boat into distant waters, he operated within a larger strategic context that was already shifting. The Indian Ocean venture represented ambitious thinking on the part of the German command, an attempt to expand the U-boat war beyond the areas where Allied defenses were becoming overwhelming. Whether this expansion could achieve meaningful results depended on numerous factors: the weather, the luck of encounter with shipping, the mechanical reliability of the boat, and the capacity of Bleichrodt and his crew to sustain effective operations across months of travel and combat, in waters so distant from home. The voyage itself would test not merely his skills as a submarine commander, but his abilities as a leader of men under conditions of isolation and danger that few sailors had experienced. The distance from base meant that failure would bring no rescue, that mechanical breakdown could mean slow death, that any significant damage to the boat would force either desperate attempts at self-rescue or the acceptance of inevitable loss. The transfer to U-109 occurred at a moment when the entire character of the submarine war was transforming. Bleichrodt had commanded a successful boat in the early, relatively easy years of the campaign. Now, taking command of a larger vessel for operations in distant waters, he would encounter both new opportunities and new forms of resistance. The improved technologies that the Allies were deploying would follow him even to the Indian Ocean. The increasing sophistication of escort tactics would eventually reach these distant waters as well. Yet for the moment, the strategic calculations suggested that these remote theatres still offered possibilities for profitable operations. Bleichrodt stood at the threshold of what would become his most significant operational period, commanding a powerful boat, leading a crew of skilled submariners, and preparing to venture into unknown waters with the knowledge that his actions and decisions in the coming months would determine the outcome of one of the most ambitious German naval initiatives of the later war years. The machinery of warfare continues its relentless operation, shifting personnel and resources according to evolving strategic needs. Bleichrodt had proven himself a capable commander in the increasingly difficult waters of the North Atlantic. Now he would have the opportunity to test his abilities in circumstances that were radically different: greater distances, less escort protection, the possibility of dramatic successes, but also the constant awareness that failure or significant damage in such distant waters meant something approaching certain loss. The next chapter of his story would unfold on routes and in waters where no U-boat commander had yet achieved the kind of success that the German Naval Command hoped might be possible. The voyage to the Indian Ocean awaited, and with it, the months of operation that would define his wartime record and ultimately establish his reputation as one of the most successful U-boat commanders of the Second World War. The Indian Ocean in 1942 represented something that had become increasingly rare for German submarine commanders: opportunity unmarked by immediate threat. After months of grueling patrols in the Atlantic, where every voyage meant running a gauntlet of destroyers, corvettes, and aircraft, the strategic planners in Berlin envisioned a bold operational shift. The waters east of Africa, vast and largely undefended by concentrated Allied naval power, offered a chance to strike at merchant shipping far from the coordinated convoy systems that had begun to strangle German surface commerce. It was to these distant waters that Bleichrodt would now sail with U-109, a vessel considerably larger and more capable than the aging U-48 he had commanded for so long. The journey itself would test his leadership in ways that no Atlantic patrol had demanded. Not the constant threat of immediate destruction, but rather the grinding endurance required to traverse nearly half the circumference of the globe underwater, hunting along the way. U-109 was a Type 1XC boat, a class designed specifically for long-range operations and greater striking power. Where the smaller Type Vic vessels that dominated the Atlantic fleet offered speed and maneuverability, the Type 1XC prioritized fuel capacity and torpedo load. With a displacement of over 1,400 tons when submerged, she was a substantial command, requiring Bleichrodt to master new technical complexities and manage a larger crew spread across more compartments. The boat had been launched 4 years earlier, in 1938, and had already accumulated considerable operational experience under previous commanders. When Bleichrodt assumed command, he inherited not a new weapon, but a proven platform, one that had demonstrated both reliability and lethal effectiveness in prior patrols. His challenge would be to bring to this larger vessel the tactical innovations and crew discipline that had marked his service aboard U-48. while adapting to the different handling characteristics and operational possibilities that the Type INXC offered. The route to the Indian Ocean was itself a perilous undertaking that few Allied commanders understood with any clarity. Rather than attempting the direct passage through the Suez Canal, now firmly under British control and heavily defended, the German Naval Command had decided that Bleichrodt and other selected commanders would navigate around the Cape of Good Hope. This meant transiting south along the West African coast, then curving eastward across the empty expanses of the South Atlantic and Southern Indian Ocean. For a submerged vessel, this route meant weeks of travel through waters occasionally patrolled by British warships and increasingly by aircraft operating from distant bases. The passage was not a battle in the conventional sense, but rather a test of seamanship, nerve, and the material endurance of the boat itself. Any mechanical failure thousands of kilometers from a friendly port would be catastrophic, a reality that bore heavily on every man aboard, though none would speak of it openly. Bleichrodt's journey began in the Bay of Biscay, already dangerous waters where British aircraft hunted relentlessly for departing or returning U-boats. The new commander demonstrated the caution and tactical awareness that characterized his command style, avoiding the most heavily patrolled zones and timing his movements to coincide with poor visibility. Once clear of the bay, he set course southwestward, following the African coast at a careful distance. The crossing of the mid-Atlantic proved relatively uneventful. Weeks of running on the surface at night, submerging by day, maintaining the slow but steady pace required by fuel conservation and the need to preserve the boat's battery charge for emergency maneuvers. The crew settled into the peculiar rhythm of long-distance submarine operations, where boredom and vigilance existed in constant tension with one another. Days blurred together beneath the routine of watches, maintenance, and the endless quiet of underwater transit. As U-109 approached the coast of southern Africa in the latter months of 1942, Bleichrodt faced his first significant test in these new waters. The Cape of Good Hope region had become a zone of increasing Allied interest, as the growing threat to shipping in the Indian Ocean became apparent. British forces had strengthened their presence at the Cape, and new patrol patterns reflected an understanding that German submarines might attempt the passage into the Indian Ocean. Bleichrodt's approach required extraordinary attention to reconnaissance and timing, determining when patrol vessels were at maximum distance, when weather conditions offered concealment, and when his boat's battery condition and fuel reserves would allow for rapid evasion if detection occurred. The tension aboard U-109 intensified as the African continent drew near, each man aware that discovery at this point, so far into the voyage, would be catastrophic. Yet Bleichrodt maintained the composed demeanor that his crew had come to expect, projecting an absolute confidence in his ability to navigate this passage successfully. The transit around the Cape tested Bleichrodt's seamanship in ways distinct from his previous Atlantic operations. The waters here were subject to violent and sudden weather systems, with currents that could push the boat off course, and winds that created patterns of visibility unpredictable to commanders accustomed to the more predictable Atlantic climate. There were encounters, moments when Allied patrol vessels appeared on the horizon, or when hydrophone operators reported distant propeller sounds that sent every man to battle stations. But each time, Bleichrodt's carefully calculated course, his understanding of patrol patterns, and his willingness to spend hours submerged in relative safety allowed U-109 to pass undetected. The passage that had been identified in planning documents as the most dangerous portion of the journey revealed itself to be navigable, though barely, for a commander willing to accept the strictest discipline and the most conservative tactical approach. Once past the Cape and into the Indian Ocean proper, the character of Bleichrodt's command underwent a subtle transformation. The vast expanse of open water, the absence of the dense shipping lanes that characterized the Atlantic, and the genuine scarcity of Allied warships in these waters created an environment almost alien to recent U-boat operations. Here was space, genuine operational space, something that German submarines had not enjoyed in European waters for more than a year. The crew, many of whom had known only the tension and danger of Atlantic patrols, began to adapt to a different kind of warfare, one that emphasized stealth and patience over the rapid, violent engagements that had defined recent operations. Bleichrodt established patrol patterns designed to intercept merchant vessels, drawing on intelligence reports about convoy movements and shipping routes. The Indian Ocean campaign would be different from anything he had previously experienced, not necessarily easier, but fundamentally altered in character by geography and the relative absence of organized Allied response. The hunting itself, when it came, demonstrated the value of the Type 1XC's range and endurance. Bleichrodt's first confirmed sinkings in Indian Ocean waters came in the early months of 1943, targeting merchant vessels that operated with minimal escort protection. Unlike the heavily defended Atlantic convoys, many ships in these waters sailed independently or in small groups, relying on the assumption that the Indian Ocean represented a relatively safe operating zone. The isolation of these waters meant that individual merchant captains, bereft of the protective umbrella offered by organized convoy systems and naval patrols, were vulnerable to the kind of determined submarine commander that Bleichrodt had proven himself to be. Each sinking added to his accumulating score. Each successful patrol demonstrated the wisdom of the German Naval Command's decision to send Type 1XC boats on these extended voyages. The distances involved meant that Bleichrodt could not return to base for resupply and rearmament as frequently as Atlantic commanders, requiring him to make careful calculations about tonnage destroyed versus fuel and torpedoes expended. Operating in the Indian Ocean also meant adjusting to the physical environment itself. The tropical heat that permeated the boat during daylight hours, when the sun's intensity beat down on the metal hull, created conditions far more oppressive than anything experienced in northern waters. The air inside the U-boat became heavy with humidity, and the accumulated body heat of more than 50 men confined in a space no larger than a modest office building. Bleichrodt's crew suffered from heat exhaustion, from the peculiar tropical diseases that occasionally broke out in such unsanitary conditions, and from the psychological strain of isolation. Mail from home became increasingly infrequent as the distance grew, and the knowledge that their boat was operating in waters where no rescue was possible if disaster struck weighed on every mind. Yet Bleichrodt maintained the standards of conduct and operational readiness that he had established aboard U-48, ensuring that the challenges of environment and isolation did not degrade the efficiency of his command. The strategic rationale for Bleichrodt's presence in these waters extended beyond the simple destruction of merchant vessels. German naval strategists understood that the war in the Atlantic had become increasingly untenable as Allied defenses improved. By dispersing U-boats across wider geographic areas, the submarine command hoped to stretch Allied resources even thinner, forcing the British and Americans to divide their already strained anti-submarine forces across multiple oceans. The Indian Ocean campaign represented a calculated gamble that by maintaining U-boat operations in distant waters, Germany could sustain a threat to Allied commerce, even as the Atlantic became an increasingly lethal zone for submarines. Bleichrodt's operations, and those of other commanders who made the journey around Africa, contributed to this broader strategic vision, though the effectiveness of this approach remained limited by the sheer distances involved and the declining number of boats available for extended deployments. As months passed, Bleichrodt's patrol in the Indian Ocean gradually transitioned from an active hunting operation to a voyage of attrition. The boat's fuel reserves, carefully husbanded through every kilometer of transit and every operational decision, began to deplete more rapidly than anticipated. The tropical climate, with its unpredictable weather and occasional encounters with Allied escort vessels, imposed its own psychological and material toll. Bleichrodt received orders to initiate his return passage to France, a journey that would prove even more hazardous than the outbound transit. The boat was now lower in the water due to fuel consumption and the weight of reduced provisions, and every kilometer traveled meant less margin for error if detection occurred. The Indian Ocean, which had seemed to offer refuge and opportunity when he had first arrived, now represented only an obstacle between his boat and the relative safety of a defended European port. The knowledge that his patrol was ending, that the hunt was transitioning to escape and evasion, changed the tenor of operations aboard U-109. The return passage around the Cape, undertaken in the latter months of 1943, occurred under increasingly challenging circumstances. By this point in the war, the British and American naval forces had begun to develop a more complete understanding of U-boat movements, including the routes taken by boats transiting to and from distant stations. Bleichrodt faced patrol patterns more aggressive than those he had encountered during his outbound journey, and the boat's reduced fuel reserves meant fewer options for evasion. The psychological strain aboard U-109 during this return passage manifested in ways both subtle and direct. Reduced sleep, increased tension during every encounter with potential Allied vessels, a growing awareness among the crew that the margin between success and catastrophe had narrowed. Yet Bleichrodt's command remained intact, his authority unquestioned, his tactical decisions still guided by the careful calculation that had brought the boat safely this far. The journey that had begun with confident departure now concluded with silent transit, and the watchful attention of a commander determined to preserve both his boat and his crew. When U-109 finally emerged into the Bay of Biscay, after months absent from European waters, Bleichrodt could reflect on an operation that, while profitable in terms of tonnage destroyed, had exposed both the possibilities and the limitations of long-range U-boat operations. The Indian Ocean campaign had demonstrated that German submarines could still strike at Allied commerce in waters far from the primary theatres of naval conflict. It had also revealed, in unmistakable terms, the extent to which the cumulative effect of the war was degrading the U-boat arm's operational capability. Boats that required months to transit to distant theatres operated with reduced frequency, and each journey carried the risk of loss that German naval resources could increasingly ill afford. Bleichrodt's return marked not a triumph, but rather a successful conclusion to a campaign whose strategic significance remained ambiguous even to the commanders who had planned it. The Indian Ocean episode would occupy a place in his record as evidence of both his competence and the desperation that increasingly characterized German naval strategy as the war entered its most dangerous phase. The year was 1942, and Heinrich Bleichrodt stood at the apex of his capabilities as a U-boat commander. The transformation from the cautious novice of 18 months prior was complete. U-109, the Type 1XC submarine that had become his charge, proved to be a formidable instrument in his hands. The Indian Ocean, that vast and sparsely defended expanse of water, had opened before him like an opportunity written in the language of war itself. The merchant vessels that plied those routes, often traveling alone or in loosely organized convoys, presented targets of almost bewildering abundance. Bleichrodt's tactics had matured into something approaching art. He understood the psychology of the hunt, the mathematics of approach angles and speed calculations, the weight of decisions made in near-total darkness beneath the surface. Around him, the crew of U-109 responded to his commands with the efficiency born of shared danger and professional respect. The tonnage records that Bleichrodt accumulated during this period placed him among the most successful U-boat commanders of the entire war. In the months spanning from early 1942 through late 1943, he was credited with sinking more than 20 major merchant vessels and seriously damaging several others. These were not merchant ships of trivial value. Many were large cargo carriers and tankers representing substantial portions of British and Allied shipping capacity. Each confirmed kill was noted in the German Naval Command's records, and Bleichrodt's name rose in the esteem of Admiral Dönitz and the officer corps of the U-boat arm. The ceremony of awarding the Knight's Cross, one of Nazi Germany's highest military decorations, came not as a surprise to those who followed his career, but rather as a formal recognition of what his operational record had already made clear. Yet even as the prestige accumulated, Bleichrodt understood something that many younger officers did not. Each sinking, each success, each confirmed kill drew the enemy's resources more directly toward him and toward the U-boat fleet as a whole. The mathematics of the Atlantic War had begun to shift in ways that were becoming increasingly difficult to deny or to overcome. When Bleichrodt had first assumed command of U-109, the advantages possessed by the U-boats remained substantial. The investment in new vessels, the maturation of tactics developed through shared experience among commanders, the relative weakness of enemy countermeasures in 1941 and early 1942, all of these factors had combined to create a period of what some commanders referred to as the happy times. But the happy times, the period of relative vulnerability on the part of merchant shipping, were contracting with accelerating speed. The British Admiralty, stung by the cumulative losses of the previous year, had begun implementing new convoy tactics with systematic rigor. Smaller, faster escort vessels equipped with improved detection equipment now shepherded merchant ships across the Atlantic with increasing effectiveness. The development of shipboard radar, initially a curiosity and then a mere inconvenience, had become a factor that forced submarine commanders to reconsider their entire approach to surface attack. Bleichrodt's response to these changing conditions demonstrated the adaptive intelligence that had made him successful in the first place. Where other commanders continued to adhere to outdated tactical approaches, Bleichrodt refined his methods in response to the evidence before him. The daylight periscope attack, once a standard tactic, became increasingly dangerous as escort vessels, equipped with improved detection capability, began to anticipate and counter such maneuvers. Bleichrodt shifted more of his hunting toward night surface attacks, utilizing the U-109's surfaced speed to approach convoy formations under cover of darkness. The torpedo, launched from a distance and in darkness, presented both technical challenges and psychological advantages. The crews of merchant ships caught in darkness by an unseen attacker often panicked, their damage control efforts less coordinated and effective than they might have been in daylight when the threat could be visually assessed. Yet the very success of these tactics meant that the Allies redoubled their efforts to counter them, bringing more resources, more ships, more weapons into the theater of operations. The escalation was relentless, and visible to any commander paying careful attention. By 1943, the number of escort vessels accompanying even modest convoys had increased dramatically compared to the previous year. Where a year or two prior, a single escort might have shepherded 10 or 12 merchant vessels, now a convoy of equivalent size might have 2, 3, or even 4 naval vessels dedicated to its protection. The weapons carried by these vessels had also improved. The depth charge, that simple but effective anti-submarine weapon, had been refined and improved in both the charges themselves and in the tactics employed to deliver them. New listening devices, the hydrophones and early sonar systems, were becoming more common aboard escort vessels, making it increasingly difficult for a submerged submarine to remain undetected for extended periods. Bleichrodt found himself forced to move deeper, remain submerged for longer, and approach targets with greater caution than had been necessary in earlier campaigns. The personal cost of these tactical necessities was substantial and grew heavier with each passing month. The long underwater patrol, the reduction in the consumption of battery power to maintain silence, the limited speed possible in the depths necessary to avoid detection, all of these factors combined to transform the experience of submarine warfare from a challenging but manageable enterprise into something approaching a psychological ordeal. The confined spaces of U-109, designed for a crew of perhaps 45 or 50 men, became a world unto itself, isolated and cut off from the sun and the sky and the normal rhythms of day and night. The air, recycled and filtered, accumulated the human detritus of close quarters, the smoke of tobacco, the dampness that seemed to permeate everything, the subtle but inescapable sense of cooking and hygiene and fear itself. Bleichrodt, as commander, maintained the professional detachment necessary to his role, but he was not immune to these pressures. The weight of decisions made in isolation, the knowledge that his orders determined whether the men under his command lived or died, the understanding that tactical decisions made in one moment might have consequences stretching across months and years, these were the burdens that came with command. The successful commander of 1943 was, by necessity, a different sort of man than the successful commander of 1941 had been. The early war had rewarded boldness and the willingness to take risks. The confidence born of numerical and technical superiority had permitted an aggressive approach to submarine warfare that prioritized volume of kills and the accumulated tonnage sunk. But that approach was becoming obsolete. The successful commander of the present moment was one who could balance aggression with caution, who understood the value of patience and of disengagement when the tactical situation no longer favored the hunter. Bleichrodt possessed this capacity for adaptation, but it came at a psychological cost that was not always apparent in the formal records of his service. The man who returned from a patrol in 1943 was more careful, more circumspect, more inclined to break off an attack if the risks seemed to outweigh the potential reward. The volume of kills might decline, but the probability of survival increased. Yet even as Bleichrodt and commanders like him adapted their tactics, the fundamental problem remained essentially unchanged. The Allies were not standing still. For every tactical innovation developed by the U-Boat Command, the escort forces and naval commands ranged against them responded with countermeasures of their own. This dynamic, this escalation, would have been visible to anyone with the perspective to understand it. The attrition rate among U-boats began to rise with accelerating speed. Boats that departed on patrol in 1943 were statistically less likely to return than boats that had departed a year earlier. Bleichrodt was aware of this through the informal networks of information that connected the German Naval Officer Corps. The losses among commanders he had trained with, officers he had known, friends who had achieved their own successes, the toll was mounting in ways that no amount of individual success could offset. The numerical advantage in new boat construction, which Germany possessed in the early part of the war, had been overcome by the enormous industrial capacity of the Allies and their ability to replace losses, repair damaged vessels, and commission new escort ships faster than Germany could produce new submarines. The question that began to crystallize in the minds of thinking commanders during this period was not whether the U-boat campaign could continue to succeed, but rather how long it could continue at all. Bleichrodt's success in 1942 and 1943, his achievement of high tonnage records, and the formal recognition that accompanied these accomplishments, occurred against a background of mounting losses and declining strategic prospects. The merchant shipping that he and other commanders sank was being replaced, and replaced more quickly and in greater numbers than German replacement capacity could match. The productive capacity of American shipyards, barely even in operation when the war began, had become a machine of almost incomprehensible scale. The strategic initiative, the sense of possibility and opportunity that had animated the U-boat campaign in 1940 and 1941 had been surrendered without a formal declaration of surrender. It was lost incrementally, through 1,000 small tactical defeats and strategic setbacks, through improved enemy capability, and through the simple mathematics of industrial production. Bleichrodt's personal response to this dawning realization took the form of intensified professionalism. If the campaign was ultimately doomed, then the proper role of the professional officer was to continue executing his duties with maximum competence and minimum waste. The tonnage that he sank was tonnage denied to the enemy, and the persistence of the U-boat threat, even in its diminished form, forced the Allies to devote enormous resources to convoy protection and anti-submarine warfare that might otherwise have been employed elsewhere. This was thin comfort, but it was the comfort available to a man who believed in the necessity of continuing to fight, even when the outcome was no longer in doubt. The emotional landscape that Bleichrodt inhabited during this period was one of professional determination mixed with a growing recognition of futility. The younger officers and crew members under his command existed in a different emotional territory. Some still believed that some miraculous turn of events might yet restore German fortunes, while others were beginning to contemplate the reality of defeat and the questions of survival and accountability that would accompany it. The final months of 1943 saw Bleichrodt's status solidify as one of the most accomplished U-boat commanders of the entire war. The formal records credited him with the destruction of more than 400,000 tons of shipping, though like all such records from this period, the exact figures were subject to debate and re-evaluation by historians in later years. What remained beyond question was that he had achieved a level of success that placed him in the upper ranks of the U-boat command hierarchy. The recognition came in the form of awards, promotions, and assignments that might have once represented the peak of his military career. But the context had changed entirely. The achievements that would have seemed like the pinnacle of success in 1941 were now achievements that had to be contextualized within a larger narrative of strategic defeat and industrial exhaustion. Bleichrodt understood this, at some level that perhaps did not rise to full conscious articulation, but that manifested itself in the caution and calculation that increasingly characterized his approach to command. The survival that Bleichrodt achieved, his own life, his continuation as a commanding officer when so many others had been lost, was itself a form of success that deserves acknowledgement alongside his combat achievements. The patrols of 1942 and 1943 were deadly affairs, and the probability of a submarine being lost during a patrol in these years was substantial and growing. That Bleichrodt emerged from this period unscathed, capable of continuing to perform his duties, was not luck alone, but rather the product of judgment, of the ability to recognize danger and to take appropriate action to avoid it. The balance between aggression and caution that he maintained, the willingness to disengage from an attack that might succeed but at unacceptable risk, the decisions made in darkness and isolation beneath the surface, all of these factors combined to permit his survival at a time when survival itself was becoming increasingly scarce among the U-boat command. As 1943 gave way to 1944, Bleichrodt had accomplished much. The question that now loomed before him, as it loomed before all German military leaders, was not what he had accomplished, but rather how he would navigate the rapidly deteriorating circumstances of the war's final phase. Chapter 12. Narration. By the early months of 1942, Heinrich Bleichrodt had become one of the Kriegsmarine's most accomplished submarine commanders. His tally of ships sunk had grown steadily across multiple patrols, and his name appeared with increasing frequency in the operational summaries transmitted from German naval headquarters. Yet beneath the surface of these statistical triumphs lay a truth that Bleichrodt and his fellow commanders could no longer ignore. The nature of submarine warfare was changing in ways that no amount of tactical cunning could fully overcome. What had once been a contest where the hunter held most of the advantages was slowly, inexorably, becoming a battle where the prey fought back with weapons and methods that the U-boat arm had never anticipated. The comfortable rhythm of the hunt, with its long stretches of patient stalking, followed by moments of violent success, was giving way to something far more precarious and exhausting. The British, in particular, had learned from the opening years of the war, with startling speed. The convoy system, which had seemed almost primitive to German commanders in 1939, had evolved into a sophisticated instrument of defense that made attacking merchant shipping an increasingly dangerous proposition. Every merchant vessel no longer sailed alone or in loose groups vulnerable to a single determined predator. Instead, they traveled in tightly organized formations, protected by an ever-expanding network of warships. These escorts came in many forms: destroyers with their superior speed, corvettes that could turn and maneuver with surprising agility, and new ships specifically designed for anti-submarine work. Behind these visible protectors stood an entire apparatus of detection and coordination that stretched across the Atlantic, a web of communication and tracking that made surprise attacks far less frequent and far more costly when they occurred. Bleichrodt had studied the reports, analyzed the patrol data from the Mediterranean and the Atlantic alike, and understood what others were only beginning to articulate. Radar represented perhaps the most troubling development from the German perspective. In the early stages of the war, U-boat commanders had enjoyed what amounted to invisibility once darkness fell or when weather provided cover. A submarine on the surface, watching through the periscope or by eye, could spot approaching vessels before those vessels could spot the submarine. This advantage had been fundamental to the entire tactical doctrine of submarine warfare. Radar shattered this assumption with brutal efficiency. A ship equipped with radar could detect a U-boat at distances the submarine's lookouts could only dream of achieving. More devastating still, the attacking U-boat often had no warning that it had been spotted. One moment, a commander might feel confident in his approach, confident in his positioning, and the next moment, a depth charge explosion would remind him that the enemy had known he was there all along. Reports filtering through the fleet spoke of these mysterious detection systems with a mixture of frustration and fear. How could one fight an enemy that could see in darkness? How could one employ tactics developed around the assumption of advantage when that advantage had been stripped away? The depth charge itself had undergone equally significant evolution. In the first years of the war, these weapons had been crude, unreliable tools that killed as many ships through concussion as through precision. A skillful U-boat commander could evade them through quick thinking and aggressive maneuvering, but the weapons had been refined and multiplied. New patterns and release mechanisms made them far more effective. More terrifyingly, the quantity available to escort vessels had increased dramatically. Convoys that had once been protected by a handful of these weapons now traveled with dozens, even hundreds available from their escort groups. A U-boat that found itself forced to dive faced an ordeal rather than an inconvenience. The sound of these explosions, transmitted through the water with brutal clarity, created a pressure not merely physical but psychological. Young submariners who had volunteered in the flush of early German victories found themselves huddling in darkened steel tubes, while the ocean itself seemed to turn hostile, filled with death from above. Bleichrodt recognized what these changes meant for operational doctrine and for the men under his command. The simple arithmetic of submarine warfare had always favored the attacker, provided he could achieve surprise. One ship sunk represented success, and if multiple ships could be damaged or destroyed in a coordinated assault, the economic logic was compelling. But this calculation only worked if the attacker could escape before retaliation became overwhelming. As 1942 progressed, escape became progressively more difficult. Convoy escorts had grown more numerous and more aggressive. They no longer merely attempted to drive off attacking submarines or protect the immediate vicinity of the merchant ships. Instead, they hunted the U-boats themselves with increasing determination, using improved detection methods and coordinated tactics that made every engagement potentially the last. Captains returning from patrol spoke of running for their lives, of riding out depth charge attacks that lasted for hours, of feeling the mounting pressure in their lungs and the growing despair of their crews as the explosions continued without respite. The impact on morale throughout the U-boat fleet manifested in ways both subtle and profound. The branch had always attracted Germany's most aggressive and talented younger officers, men who understood that submarine command represented one of the few independent commands still available in the modern Navy. The chance to command, to exercise judgment and boldness far from supervisory scrutiny, had made the U-boat service attractive despite its obvious dangers. But as casualties mounted and success became harder to achieve, the nature of recruitment changed. Young officers still volunteered, but increasingly they seemed driven by a sense of duty or desperation rather than ambition. The stories filtering back from patrols no longer emphasized the tactical cleverness of the hunt, but rather the grinding horror of submarine warfare. Boats that failed to return were spoken of in whispers. Estimates of U-boat losses from all causes began to approach and eventually exceed the number of new boats entering service. The mathematical reality was becoming impossible to disguise. Bleichrodt witnessed this shift directly during his time in command of U-109. The Indian Ocean operations, which had seemed to offer fresh hunting grounds and respite from the intensifying Allied pressure in the Atlantic, had come with their own complications. The journey around Africa consumed vast quantities of fuel and time. The longer ranges meant less time actually conducting operations, and the greater distances involved meant that resupply became a critical logistical problem. Intelligence about shipping patterns proved less reliable than intelligence gathered about Atlantic convoys. The ocean itself, vast and empty, could work against the hunter as easily as it worked in his favor. Bleichrodt had achieved successes in these waters, but the pattern he observed was unmistakable. Each patrol seemed to yield somewhat fewer results than the last. Each patrol seemed to encounter more active resistance. Each patrol claimed more men from the crews, not through enemy action, but through the simple attrition of existence in a submarine thousands of kilometers from home, operating on equipment that deteriorated faster than repairs could address. Communications with headquarters revealed the growing desperation in German naval thinking. Proposals emerged for new technologies, new tactics, new strategic approaches. Some were ingenious, others merely desperate. The German Navy had invested enormous hopes in scientific solutions to the submarine problem, believing that engineering could compensate for the strategic and tactical advantages the Allies had accumulated. New U-boats with improved capabilities were promised. Boats that could dive deeper, stay submerged longer, move faster through the water. These were not fantasies. The technical specifications were real, the designs advanced, but they existed on paper and in shipyards, while the patrols had to be conducted with boats that were increasingly worn, increasingly vulnerable, and increasingly obsolete. The gap between what command promised and what reality delivered grew wider with each passing month. Officers and men alike began to understand that the time for victory had passed, and what remained was a fight for survival dressed in the language of continued strategic purpose. The tactical dilemma confronting Bleichrodt and his peers seemed almost unsolvable. The traditional approach, surface attacks at night using high speed and maneuverability to achieve surprise, had become suicidally dangerous when radar-equipped escorts were present. Submerged attacks remained possible, but were far slower and demanded greater precision. The periscope, which had always seemed such a marvelous instrument, now felt like a beacon that invited enemy attack. Stay down too long, and information degraded. Observation windows closed. The submarine became essentially blind. Come up to sea and navigate, and the risk of detection increased exponentially. Some commanders began experimenting with new tactics, attacking convoys at night from underwater, with the boat barely submerged, using hydrophones to track the locations of target ships. But these methods were uncertain and consumed precious battery power. Others advocated for deeper diving and patience, waiting for targets to come to them. But this required almost unlimited time and offered no guarantee of success. Every patrol became a unique equation, with too many variables and insufficient control over most of them. The human cost of this stalemate manifested in the casualty rates that began to dominate crew conversations and private thoughts. U-boat losses had risen steadily throughout 1941 and into 1942. The branch celebrated the men who survived their patrols and mourned those who did not, but the mathematical reality was becoming undeniable. A submariner's life expectancy, once calculated in completed patrols, now seemed to be measured in months. The crews knew the odds, or at least they suspected them with terrible accuracy. These were not conscripts pressed into service against their will, but volunteers, men who had chosen the U-boat arm believing that courage, skill, and determination might prove sufficient to overcome any obstacle. That belief was being tested in the deepest possible way. Officers like Bleichrodt had to maintain discipline and morale, while privately recognizing that many of the men serving under their command would not survive the war. The weight of that knowledge, carried silently and professionally, became its own burden, that no depth charge or mechanical failure could have imposed. Bleichrodt's correspondence from this period, where glimpses of his thinking survive, reveals a professional officer adjusting to a changing reality without surrendering his competence or his sense of duty. He continued to pursue patrols with the same methodical precision he had always employed. He studied the available intelligence about convoy schedules and routing, calculated probability matrices about where targets might be encountered, positioned his boats to maximize whatever advantages circumstance and technology could provide. But the tone had shifted. Success, where it came, seemed almost accidental rather than the inevitable result of superior planning and execution. The victories accumulated, more tonnage was sunk, and yet there was no sense that these victories mattered strategically. The Allies seemed to replace every ship that was lost, to send more escorts, to develop new weapons, to tighten their noose. The individual battles in the Atlantic continued, but the larger war was slowly being lost beneath the waves. The year 1942 became a watershed moment in this transformation. It marked the point where U-boat commanders like Bleichrodt, men of intelligence and military professionalism, began to fully comprehend that the character of naval warfare in the Atlantic had fundamentally changed. The early sense of advantage, the confidence that came from understanding that one possessed superior tactical knowledge and aggressive spirit, had given way to a grimmer recognition. The Allies had adapted, they had learned, they had developed countermeasures and strategies that turned the submarine from hunter into hunted. The ocean, which had seemed so vast and so full of vulnerability, had been transformed into a zone of increasing danger. The cost of operations, measured in boats lost and men killed, was rising toward levels that could not be sustained indefinitely. Yet patrols continued, orders flowed from headquarters, and commanders like Bleichrodt prepared their boats and their crews for operations that increasingly resembled not strategic opportunities, but grim exercises in calculated risk. The question was no longer whether the U-boats could win the war, but how long the service could continue to fight before the mathematics of attrition rendered further resistance impossible. By 1944, the German submarine fleet had become a force fighting not for victory, but for survival. The great dream of strangling Britain through commerce warfare had collapsed under the weight of superior Allied technology, production capacity, and tactical innovation. Where once U-boat commanders had prowled the Atlantic with relative impunity, they now operated in an ocean increasingly saturated with enemy escorts, aircraft, and detection systems that rendered the underwater realm as dangerous as any conventional battlefield. Bleichrodt, now an experienced officer with years of patrols behind him and significant tonnage to his name, was about to assume command of a vessel that represented something fundamentally different from the U-boats of the earlier war years. U-Boat 702 was a Type Vik submarine, the workhorse design that had carried the burden of Germany's underwater campaign. While the earlier Type 1XC boats offered greater range and cargo capacity for the distant operations Bleichrodt had conducted, the Type Vik was faster in certain respects and more maneuverable, attributes that had become essential in an environment where evasion and quick response meant the difference between a successful patrol and the ocean floor. The circumstances surrounding Bleichrodt's assumption of command tell us much about the dire state of the U-boat arm in 1944. Officers of his experience and proven capability were no longer candidates for training squadrons or easier positions. Instead, they were drawn back into operational commands, their expertise desperately needed to preserve what remained of Germany's submarine force. The personnel situation had become catastrophic. Thousands of trained submariners had been lost since 1941, and the pipeline of replacement officers and experienced sailors was running dangerously dry. Younger men were being rushed through abbreviated training programs, their seasickness and inexperience showing in the way they moved about a boat's cramped interior. Bleichrodt, commanding U-702, would inherit a crew that blended a handful of experienced petty officers with numerous sailors who had never heard the sound of depth charges bursting around their vessel. These men looked to their captain for reassurance, for the steady hand that might guide them through patrols where the odds had shifted decisively against them. Bleichrodt accepted the command, knowing that his reputation, built over years of successful operations, would be tested in entirely new ways. He would no longer be hunting in waters where he held tactical advantage. Instead, he would be struggling to survive in an ocean that had become an Allied domain. The technical and operational constraints facing U-Boat 702 reflected the larger strategic collapse of the German submarine campaign. Fuel availability had become erratic and uncertain. The synthetic fuel plants that had been constructed to replace captured oil supplies were targets of relentless Allied bombing campaigns, their output declining month by month. Boats heading out on patrol had to consider whether they would have sufficient fuel to return to port, a calculation that would have been unthinkable to commanders in 1940 and 1941. Supply and maintenance in the bases, once efficient and reliable, had become problematic. The great U-boat pens at Brest, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, and La Rochelle were under constant air attack, their repair facilities damaged or destroyed, their administrative systems disrupted by the constant pressure of bombardment. Parts were increasingly difficult to obtain, improvisation replacing proper maintenance procedures. The radar equipment that U-boats carried was obsolete compared to the detection systems being deployed by Allied escort vessels and aircraft. Bleichrodt and his fellow commanders had grown accustomed to receiving new intelligence about enemy capabilities, each report more sobering than the last. Sonar, in particular, had become a constant nightmare. Where submariners once had time to detect and evade approaching escorts, the new sonar sets provided Allied vessels with detection ranges that left little room for maneuver. When Bleichrodt took command of U-702, he inherited not just a submarine, but a complex web of survival challenges that no amount of skill or experience could entirely overcome. The boat itself was mechanically sound when it left the yards, a reassurance in a time when quality control had begun to deteriorate due to labor shortages and the constant pressure to maintain production. The crew complement was approximately 50 men, packed into a vessel where personal space was measured in inches. Officers shared tiny cabins with equipment and charts. Enlisted men slept in rotating shifts, taking berths still warm from their predecessors. The air became thick with cigarette smoke, diesel fumes, and the accumulated smell of unwashed bodies confined in a steel tube. The galley produced adequate if monotonous food, and the cook's ability to create variety from limited supplies became an important factor in crew morale. The torpedo room, the radio compartment, the diesel engines, the batteries housed in the bilges, every space in the boat served multiple purposes. Every man knew his duties intimately through constant drilling and repetition. Bleichrodt established his command methodology with quiet efficiency, his demeanor reflecting the gravity of the times. He was not a shouting commander or one prone to theatrical displays of authority. Instead, he communicated through steady expectation, an understanding that each member of the crew would perform their role with precision because their survival depended upon it. The patrol cycle that Bleichrodt and U-702 would follow represented the new reality of 1944 operations. Boats would depart from their bases with explicit orders to conduct surveillance, to attack enemy shipping if the opportunity presented itself safely, and increasingly, to serve as reconnaissance vessels gathering intelligence about Allied naval movements and convoy positions. The hunting grounds had contracted significantly. The Atlantic wolf pack operations of earlier years were largely abandoned as a tactic because the concentration of U-boats had become a liability rather than an asset. Allied escorts and aircraft could detect multiple submarines and coordinate attacks against them with devastating effect. Lone boats or small groups of 2 or 3 submarines now operated in relatively dispersed formations, maintaining radio silence except in emergencies, their movements coordinated through broad operational zones rather than specific tactical coordination. Bleichrodt would receive his orders before departure, understand the patrol area assigned to him, and then proceed with the knowledge that radio contact would be minimal. The isolation was profound. Weeks would pass with no word from other German forces, no confirmation of how the war was progressing in other theaters, only the constant awareness that the enemy was everywhere and alert. Messages that did arrive often carried grim tidings. U-boat 700 and something had not returned from patrol. U-boat something else had been sunk by escorts. Another had limped back to port damaged and with heavy casualties. Bleichrodt's approach to the challenges of 1944 reflected a subtle but important shift in the consciousness of senior U-boat commanders. Earlier in the war, there had been an expectation of victory, a sense that despite mounting losses, Germany would ultimately prevail, and that the sacrifice of submarine crews served a strategic purpose that would be vindicated. By 1944, no one who understood the true situation harbored such illusions. The American industrial machine was producing merchant ships faster than German submarines could sink them. The British had not capitulated despite years of pressure. The Soviet Union, though grievously wounded, continued to fight. The invasion of Normandy in June of 1944 had been repulsed, not through any action of the U-boats, but had instead led to the consolidation of overwhelming Allied force in Western Europe. Bleichrodt and officers like him faced an existential question. What was the purpose of continuing operations when the outcome was already decided? Some commanders, particularly younger men without extensive combat experience, might have succumbed to despair or resigned themselves to fatalism. Bleichrodt instead adopted a posture of careful professionalism. He would conduct his patrols with maximum efficiency and minimum risk. He would seek to preserve his vessel and crew. He would obey orders, but he would do so in a manner that maximized the likelihood of survival. This was not cowardice or abandonment of duty. Rather, it was a mature recognition that the best service he could render his men was to bring them home. The training and preparation for each patrol under Bleichrodt's command reflected these priorities. The crew drilled constantly in the procedures for detecting enemy forces, for maneuvering to evade attack, for emergency responses to incoming depth charges or torpedo attacks. Bleichrodt ensured that every man understood not just his primary duties, but also the cross-trained responsibilities that would allow the crew to function if key personnel were killed or injured. The officers conducted regular chart study and tactical discussions, reviewing the latest intelligence about enemy dispositions and capabilities. Bleichrodt emphasized situational awareness with an intensity that some of the younger sailors found exhausting. He wanted every member of the crew to understand that survival depended upon constant vigilance, upon the ability to sense danger before it manifested fully. The approach contrasted with the more aggressive tactics of earlier years when commanders took calculated risks in pursuit of tonnage and in service of the broader strategic objective of strangling enemy commerce. By 1944, the calculus had inverted. The risk of losing a U-boat and its crew had to be weighed against the diminishing prospect of achieving significant success. Bleichrodt calculated this balance with the mathematics of experience, knowing that a submarine which survived to patrol again carried more value than one which achieved a spectacular success and did not return. The departure of U-702 from its home port in 1944 carried none of the ceremony or public recognition that had accompanied the earlier war patrols. The bands no longer played, the crews no longer lined the docks to wave goodbye, the newspapers no longer carried the names of the boats and their commanders. Instead, the submarine slipped away quietly, often at night, proceeding through the defended channels with heightened vigilance against the possibility of air attack or mines. Once clear of the coastal waters and into the open ocean, Bleichrodt would set course for his assigned patrol area, maintaining a zigzag course to present a difficult target for any lurking aircraft. The routine of underwater patrol remained largely unchanged in its basic mechanics. The boat would spend much of its time submerged during daylight hours, when enemy aircraft posed the greatest threat, surfacing at night to recharge its batteries and scout the horizon for potential targets or hostile vessels. The watch officers standing on the bridge during these night hours maintained constant visual scan, knowing that the beam of a searchlight or the silhouette of an enemy escort ship could appear with sudden and catastrophic consequences. Below decks, the crew settled into the rhythms of patrol, standing watch in 4-hour rotations, maintaining the diesel engines and electrical systems, servicing the torpedoes, and maintaining the weapons that represented the boat's only offensive capability. The officers studied weather patterns, enemy convoy routes based on available intelligence, and the tactical dispositions of Allied naval forces in the region. Encounters with enemy forces had become more frequent and more methodical in 1944, where earlier in the war, a U-boat commander might locate a convoy and attempt to maneuver for an attack with reasonable confidence in his ability to evade the escorts. By this later period, even spotting a convoy without immediately being detected had become problematic. The radar sets carried by escort vessels could detect a submarine at night on the surface at distances of up to several kilometers. Bleichrodt's approach was to maintain maximum distance from enemy formations, to observe and report rather than to attack. This intelligence-gathering function had become increasingly important to German naval command, as the dwindling resources and prospects meant that information about Allied movements carried strategic value. When Bleichrodt did identify targets, he approached with meticulous caution, studying the escort disposition, calculating the risks, and often deciding to pass without attacking if the margin of safety seemed inadequate. Some of the younger crew members found this frustrating, their expectations shaped by the tales of earlier patrols when tonnage was sunk regularly and commanders returned with impressive scores. Bleichrodt explained his reasoning with a calm clarity. A U-boat that returned to port, even without sinking cargo vessels, could be repaired, refueled, and sent out again. A U-boat that attempted an attack against an alert and well-trained escort force might be sunk, taking its entire crew to the bottom. The logic was irrefutable, though it represented a difficult transition in the psychology of submarine warfare. The mechanical reliability of U-702 became an increasing concern as the patrol continued. The diesel engines, worked hard in the service of other patrols, began to develop minor faults that required the engineer officers to improvise repairs with limited spare parts. A fuel line showed signs of corrosion, presenting the constant risk of contamination in the fuel system. The batteries, the heart of the boat's underwater performance, showed signs of degradation, their capacity declining as they approached the end of their service life. The electrical systems, straining under the constant demands of the sophisticated equipment the boat carried, developed intermittent faults that were difficult to diagnose and frustrating to address. Bleichrodt and his chief engineer, the senior enlisted sailor responsible for the power plants, conducted a careful assessment of the boat's condition and determined that while serious repairs would be required upon return to port, the vessel could safely continue the patrol. This calculation itself represented the tightening constraints of the late-war submarine campaign. A year or two earlier, a boat developing these problems might have been sent to the yards for extensive overhaul and modernization. By 1944, it would be patched. The crew would be warned to use minimal electrical power and to avoid demanding maneuvers that might stress failing systems, and the boat would be returned to operational patrol. The crew adapted with the resilience of men who had little alternative. As weeks passed, and the patrol continued into its middle phase, Bleichrodt faced the combination of boredom and tension that characterized submarine operations in the late war period. The boat might travel for days without encountering any sign of enemy activity, the monotony of watching the unchanging ocean threatening to dull the alertness that survival demanded. Then, suddenly, a radar contact would appear. A distant ship would emerge from the mist, or a radio operator would intercept an enemy transmission indicating proximity. These moments required instant transition from routine to full alert, the crew moving with trained efficiency to investigate the contact or to take evasive action. Bleichrodt maintained the discipline that prevented premature action or hasty decisions. He would verify the contact, assess the threat level, and determine the appropriate response. Often, the contact would prove to be a neutral vessel or a false alarm, and the boat would return to patrol status. Other times, the contact would be confirmed as an Allied vessel or convoy, and Bleichrodt would make the complex decision whether the tactical situation warranted an attack or whether evasion and distance were the better choice. These decisions accumulated over the course of a patrol, and by the time U-702 turned toward home, Bleichrodt would carry the weight of choices made under incomplete information and persistent danger. The return journey home brought new perils as the pass. By the spring of 1944, the Atlantic had transformed from a hunting ground into a graveyard. The vast ocean that had promised wealth and glory to German submariners had become a trap of their own making, a space where technology, numbers, and determination converged to systematically dismantle the U-boat arm. Bleichrodt, now commanding U-boat 702, would witness the final act of what had once been the most feared naval force in European waters. The change had not come suddenly, but its acceleration was brutal and unmistakable. Officers who had survived 3 or 4 patrols now considered themselves fortunate. Younger men, barely trained, took boats to sea knowing their chances of return had become almost theoretical. The mathematics of the Atlantic War had turned decisively against Germany. In 1942, when Bleichrodt had achieved his greatest successes in distant waters, the German U-boat fleet could still operate with a measure of calculated risk. By early 1944, that calculation had shifted into territory approaching desperation. The Allies had deployed escort groups of unprecedented sophistication, destroyer escorts, frigates, corvettes, and trawlers working in coordinated patterns that left fewer and fewer gaps through which a submarine could slip undetected. More crucially, radar technology had advanced to the point where the hunter could no longer rely on darkness to mask his approach. A U-boat surfacing at night to recharge its batteries or to gain better visibility for attack now risked detection from aircraft or surface vessels equipped with technology the Germans had only partially understood until it was far too late to mount an adequate response. The convoy system that Churchill had insisted upon at the war's beginning had evolved into a scientific discipline. Merchant ships no longer sailed independently, prey for any waiting predator. They moved in formations, protected by escorts whose crews had learned through bitter experience and painful loss how to coordinate their defenses against the submarine threat. The techniques were straightforward but effective: hedgehog mortars that fired pattern explosions ahead of a ship's path, sonobuoys that listened for the distinctive sound of diesel engines, and depth charges deployed with mathematical precision based on acoustic readings and estimated depth calculations. A U-boat commander in 1944 faced not merely individual ships, but systems of protection that had been refined through 3 years of practical warfare and backed by resources the German Navy could never hope to match. The toll on the U-boat fleet had become catastrophic. During 1943, German submarines had sunk less tonnage than they had in any previous year of the war. Yet losses had continued to mount relentlessly. Crews who had trained together, who understood each other in the claustrophobic confines of a submarine hull, were simply erased from the war. A U-boat attacked by aircraft-dropped depth charges in 1944 had virtually no chance of escaping unless it was fortunate enough to be operating in shallow enough water to reach the bottom and sit quietly, hoping the hunter would eventually move on. More often, the depth charges would continue, the pressure hull would fracture, and another vessel would sink, taking with it somewhere between 40 and 50 men, most of them never even knowing the moment of their death. The casualty rate among U-boat crews had reached levels that would have seemed unthinkable in the war's early years. Grand Admiral Dönitz, who had built the U-boat arm into the formidable weapon it had become, faced an increasingly impossible situation. He knew his submarines were being sent to sea with diminishing prospects of survival and minimal chance of achieving meaningful results. Yet the Reich demanded their presence, their effort, and ultimately their sacrifice. New boats were entering service regularly, but they were versions of designs that had been essentially obsolete since 1942. The Type Vic submarine that Bleichrodt now commanded was reliable and well constructed, but it was fundamentally a craft designed for surface warfare, enhanced by the ability to submerge, not a true submarine capable of extended underwater operation at speed. Against enemies who had developed underwater detection to a fine art and possessed vastly superior resources, even the finest conventional submarine was gradually becoming a tool of suicide rather than strategy. The patrols themselves had changed in character from what they had been in 1941 and 1942, when Bleichrodt had made his reputation. Where once a commander might operate in a given area for weeks, engaging targets of opportunity and attempting to evade patrolling forces, the rhythm had now reversed. Patrols meant attempting to traverse dangerous waters, avoiding contact whenever possible, and hoping to locate a convoy, itself increasingly heavily guarded and equipped with defenses that made attack a desperate gamble. Many U-boats were never found, or were found only when their own survival pressures forced them to surface or attempt an escape to port. The silence of the Atlantic, once the home of stalking predators, had become the silence of death itself. Bleichrodt's own experience informed his understanding of the disaster unfolding around him. He had served alongside men he respected deeply, officers of considerable skill who had been lost to the expanding arc of Allied military power. The losses affected him differently than they might have affected younger commanders just entering service. He could remember when things had been different, when the future had seemed open, when a skilled U-boat commander with favorable circumstances might achieve significant results and return to port. Now the future meant a lottery where the odds were measured in hours remaining rather than potential tonnage sunk or victories achieved. The professional distance that officers cultivated to manage the realities of military command was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain when the pattern was so unambiguously one of systematic destruction. The broader strategy that had once animated German submarine operations, the theory that enough tonnage sunk could cripple British war production and force negotiation, had simply dissolved like fog under the weight of American industrial capacity. The United States, with its factories running at full capacity and its merchant ship construction programs operating at levels that dwarfed German sinking rates, had rendered the entire premise of the commerce war obsolete. Bleichrodt understood this, even if official pronouncements continued to insist that U-boat operations remained strategically vital. The statistics told a different story. For every ship sunk in 1944, 3 new ships emerged from American shipyards. For every U-boat that returned safely from patrol, another was being detected, attacked, and destroyed by increasingly competent Allied forces armed with weapons specifically designed to identify and eliminate submarines. The human cost weighed on command structures throughout the German Navy. Officers were being asked to order men to sea, knowing that the probability of loss was extraordinarily high. Some commanders found ways to interpret their orders loosely, taking their boats on patrol, but remaining in areas of relative safety, attempting to complete their missions while preserving their crews. Others threw themselves into attacks with desperate aggression, as if intensity and courage could somehow overcome the fundamental technological and numerical disparities. Bleichrodt occupied a middle ground, a professional officer following orders from superiors who themselves faced impossible circumstances, adapting his tactics as situations demanded, but increasingly aware that the entire structure was coming apart. The atmosphere in German U-boat bases during 1944 was fundamentally different from that of earlier years. Where once there had been anticipation before patrol, discussions of tactics, analysis of merchant shipping reports, calculations of fuel efficiency, and optimal hunting grounds, now there was a more somber mood. The boats were still maintained with meticulous care by crews who took pride in their work, but the conversation that surrounded their departure reflected deeper concerns. Wives and families who accompanied officers to port knew that the odds of return had deteriorated significantly. The U-boat arm still maintained its elite reputation, but that reputation now carried the weight of sacrifice rather than the promise of triumph. In the midst of this deteriorating situation, Bleichrodt continued to fulfill his responsibilities. He studied the reports of other patrols, analyzed the tactics that had proven most survivable in the current conditions, and prepared his boat and crew with the professionalism that defined his career. He understood that his role now was not to achieve record tonnages or historic sinkings, but to preserve his crew as much as circumstances allowed while conducting the operations his orders demanded. This shift from ambition to survival reflected the broader reality facing the U-boat fleet in 1944. The strategic collapse was not yet complete, but it was visible to anyone with eyes to see. The Atlantic, that vast ocean that had once seemed the domain of German submarines, was becoming a place where the hunted could no longer hide from their hunters, where technology and numbers had finally combined to reverse the outcome that many had believed would define the war. The U-boat fleet was entering its final chapter, though the script was still being written and the end was not yet definitively fixed. Officers like Bleichrodt, who had served through the entire arc of submarine warfare, from the early successes of 1940 through the grim realities of 1944, carried within them the knowledge of what had been lost and what could never be recovered. The fortress of the Atlantic was failing, not in a single moment of catastrophic defeat, but through a gradual, relentless erosion of German capability against increasingly overwhelming Allied strength. Every patrol now was an act of endurance against both the enemy and the slow recognition that the world being fought for no longer existed, if it ever truly had. The war that had seemed limitless in 1941 now wore the face of exhaustion by 1944. Heinrich Bleichrodt stood in the control room of U-Boat 702, a Type Wissig submarine that represented the German Navy's shrinking options rather than its ambitions. Around him, the vessel hummed with the constrained energy of machinery pushed beyond its design specifications. Engines that had been refitted too many times, systems that had been jury-rigged by engineers who no longer had access to replacement parts. The boat itself was only 3 years old, launched in 1942, when such vessels still represented a formidable threat to Allied shipping. Now, in the final year of the conflict, it felt like a relic from a different era of the war entirely. Bleichrodt had commanded submarines before, had experienced the thrill of the hunt and the weight of command beneath the waves, but this patrol would be unlike anything he had encountered. The Atlantic through which he now navigated was no longer the hunting ground of his earlier career. It had become a graveyard. The decision to send U-702 to sea at all reflected the desperation that gripped the German naval command structure. Admiral Dönitz, the man who had envisioned a vast submarine fleet capable of strangling British commerce, now faced the mathematical certainty of defeat. His U-boats were being lost faster than they could be replaced. In 1943, the losses had begun to mount catastrophically. In 1944, the attrition had become almost incomprehensible in its scope. The submarine fleet, that had once numbered in the hundreds, was now depleted, scattered, and increasingly ineffectual. Yet the orders still came from Berlin, still demanded that patrols continue, that crews venture forth into an ocean dominated by enemies equipped with radar, sonar, aircraft that could locate a submarine from vast distances, and escort vessels that had learned to hunt submarines with lethal efficiency. Bleichrodt understood the mathematics. He had watched it unfold across 4 years of war. He knew that the chances of returning from this patrol were substantially less than even. Yet he prepared his crew, checked his course, and waited for the order to depart. The gathering of supplies for this final patrol revealed the material collapse of the German war effort. Fuel oil that had once been plentiful was now rationed so carefully that every voyage had to be calculated to the precise distance the boat could travel and return. Provisions came in smaller quantities and of noticeably lower quality than Bleichrodt had known in the earlier years of his command. The crew, once selected from the finest recruits in the Kriegsmarine, now included many men who had been hastily trained, transferred from other branches of the service, or promoted beyond their experience level. Bleichrodt's first officer was capable, but the petty officers and enlisted men represented a broader cross-section of German society, pressed into a service for which they had received minimal preparation. The morale aboard was not hostile, but it was thick with resignation. These men understood what lay ahead. They had heard the reports, scattered though they were, of other U-boats that had departed on patrol and never returned. They had seen the faces of the survivors who made it back. They understood that this final push into the Atlantic was less about achieving military objectives and more about maintaining the fiction that Germany still possessed a functioning navy. The departure from the French coast was conducted with far less ceremony than the grand sendings off that had marked earlier years of the war. There were no crowds, no speeches, no photographers recording the moment for the Reich's propaganda apparatus. The war had become a grim affair of routine and procedure, stripped of the pageantry that had once surrounded U-boat operations. Bleichrodt gave the order to cast off, felt the gentle motion as the submarine slipped away from the dock, and guided U-702 toward the open Atlantic with the precision that 4 years of command had embedded in his reflexes. The North Sea gave way to the open waters beyond, and Bleichrodt settled into the routines of command that had become as natural as breathing. He ordered the boat to operational depth, established the watch rotation, and began the patient process of searching for targets in a sea that had become notably empty of prey. The merchant traffic that had once flowed in regular patterns across the Atlantic had largely been rerouted, protected by convoy systems, defended by escort groups that had become formidable adversaries. For weeks, U-702 moved through waters that offered nothing. Bleichrodt maintained his course, managed his fuel consumption with meticulous attention, and kept his crew engaged in the endless routines that occupied a submarine during a patrol. There was maintenance to be performed on systems that were aging beyond their expected service life. There were calculations to be made regarding fuel reserves, with each estimate offering diminishing margins for error or deviation. There were the psychological routines that crews developed to maintain sanity in the close, stale air of a submarine moving underwater, the darkness broken only by the dim glow of instrument panels, the constant awareness that above them prowled enemies equipped with every advantage that technology could provide. Bleichrodt understood the monotony as well as any man who had served in submarines, but he also understood that the monotony was itself a form of danger. Crews became careless during long periods without action. Alertness dulled. The discipline that kept men alive in combat situations began to fray. He worked to maintain that discipline, to keep his men focused despite the grinding emptiness of day after day, with no contact, no purpose beyond mere survival. Then came the contact. A merchant vessel, traveling alone, unescorted, moving through the waters that had become increasingly dangerous for such vessels. It should have been a moment of triumph for Bleichrodt, a chance to prove that his tactics and his boat remained lethal threats to Allied shipping. Instead, what unfolded was a study in the constraints that now governed submarine warfare. As Bleichrodt maneuvered to attack, moving into firing position with the care that experience had taught him, his hydrophone operators detected the sounds that every U-boat captain had learned to dread. Multiple vessels closing on their position, escort ships responding to signals that the merchant had evidently transmitted upon sighting the submarine. The opportunity that had seemed to present itself evaporated as quickly as it had appeared. Bleichrodt made the decision to withdraw rather than press the attack, a choice that would have been unthinkable in the heady days of 1940 and 1941, when aggressive actions had yielded tonnage and victories. Now, survival had become the paramount objective. He ordered the boat deeper, changed course, and waited for the escort vessels to lose track of him in the vast darkness of the Atlantic. The psychological toll of this withdrawal was perhaps more significant than any physical damage could have been. The crew understood what had transpired. They had the training to recognize the sounds of approaching vessels, to understand that their boat had been forced to abandon a promising target. The thought that they had come all this distance, endured all the privations of the voyage, only to slink away from a potential prize without firing a shot, weighed heavily on morale. Bleichrodt saw it in the eyes of his men, in the way conversations became more sparse, in the way the routines of the boat seemed to require more effort to maintain. He had commanded men long enough to understand that the crew's confidence in the mission and in their chances of returning alive had been further eroded. Yet he could not afford to let his own doubts become visible. The captain of a submarine was not merely a military commander, but the central figure around which the crew's sense of purpose and possibility revolved. If Bleichrodt showed despair, the despair would spread through the boat like a poison, making dangerous any situation that might arise. Days continued to pass with the same grinding monotony, punctuated now by periodic contacts with escort vessels, always at distances that prevented engagement, always requiring evasion rather than confrontation. Bleichrodt's fuel calculations became increasingly critical. The boat had not been designed for this extended duration at sea without significant resupply. The engines were consuming the precious diesel at a rate that left little margin for additional patrols, for extended searches, for any deviation from the most direct course back to the French coast. He began to consider, with increasing seriousness, the question of whether the voyage should be extended further, or whether he should begin the journey home with whatever limited success the patrol had yielded. The decision was complicated by the fact that transmitting any message to higher command risked giving away his position to the numerous Allied listening stations that monitored German radio traffic. Radio silence had become not merely a tactical advantage, but an essential element of survival for any U-boat operating in the heavily patrolled waters of the Atlantic. It was during the return journey, as Bleichrodt navigated back toward the French coast, that the mechanical failure occurred. One of the diesel engines, stressed beyond its operational limits by months of continuous service without proper maintenance, experienced a critical malfunction that would require extensive repair to restore to operating condition. The boat now had reduced power, reduced speed, and reduced capacity to evade if contact came. Bleichrodt gathered his engineering officer and his chief petty officer, men who had kept this boat functioning through years of strain, and listened to their assessment. The repairs could be accomplished, they assured him, but they would require time, and any significant work would produce noise that might alert listening vessels above. He made the decision to proceed carefully, at reduced speed, and to attempt the repairs during the hours when atmospheric conditions made detection more difficult. It was a calculated risk, as so many aspects of submarine command had become by this stage of the war. The approach to the French coast carried its own perils. The waters surrounding the port facilities had become heavily defended as the Allies prepared for their eventual invasion of occupied France. Aircraft patrols had increased in frequency and sophistication. Escort groups ranged through the waters with regularity that suggested thorough knowledge of German patrol patterns. Bleichrodt had received information, before departure, that the defences had been strengthened, but the reality of navigating through those defences proved far more daunting than any briefing could have conveyed. He moved cautiously, used every technique he had learned across 4 years of war to remain undetected, and monitored the sounds of the ocean above him with the intensity of a man who understood that any error in judgment would likely prove fatal. The crew maintained their positions, alert but exhausted, moving through the final hours of the patrol with the understanding that safety was now within reach if they could remain undetected. When U-702 finally surfaced and received the signals indicating that friendly forces were confirming its approach, Bleichrodt permitted himself a moment of quiet acknowledgement of the fact that his final patrol had ended in survival. The boat limped back to port with one engine operating at reduced capacity, with minimal fuel reserves remaining, and with a crew that had endured weeks of tension and confinement without achieving any significant success against enemy shipping. The patrol had been, by any objective military standard, a failure. They had sighted targets but engaged none. They had consumed fuel and resources without producing any measurable strategic contribution to the German war effort. What they had achieved was survival, the simple fact of returning to port alive. In the final months of the Second World War, when the German Navy was being systematically destroyed and the collapse of the Third Reich was becoming mathematically inevitable, survival had become perhaps the only meaningful measure of success. As Bleichrodt supervised the process of securing his boat and conducting the post-operational inspection, he could see in the faces of his crew a mixture of relief and resignation. The war was ending. Every man aboard U-702 understood this. The questions that now occupied their thoughts were not about military victory or future patrols. They were about what would happen to them, to their families, to Germany itself as the conflict wound down toward its conclusion. Bleichrodt himself had begun to contemplate these questions during the long hours of the patrol, during the moments when he sat in the captain's quarters and allowed his mind to move beyond the immediate tactical considerations of keeping the boat safe and finding targets. This patrol had been his last. He did not know it yet, did not have confirmation from the naval command, but he sensed it with the certainty of a man who had spent 4 years learning to read the signs of a changing situation. The age of the U-boat offensive was over. The Atlantic was no longer a hunting ground, but a vast trap. Whatever his future held, it would not involve commanding submarines against British shipping. That chapter of his war had closed, quietly, without ceremony, on the grey waters of the North Atlantic. By the beginning of 1944, the German U-boat fleet existed in a state of progressive diminishment. The waters that had once belonged to Bleichrodt and his peers had become a graveyard. Convoys now travelled with destroyer escorts, with corvettes, with frigates equipped with sonar that could detect a submarine at distances previously unthinkable. Aircraft patrolled the skies with searchlights and depth charges. The strategic situation that had made submarine warfare a weapon of decisive consequence had collapsed under the weight of Allied production, Allied coordination, and the slow accumulation of tactical knowledge purchased at the price of German blood. Bleichrodt, now in his early 40s, had survived longer than most. He had earned his reputation not through reckless aggression, but through a combination of technical skill, patience, and an almost intuitive understanding of how to read the ocean's surface for signs of danger below. But survival alone was no longer the measure of success. The very concept of success had become hollow. In early 1944, Bleichrodt's operational patrols began to dwindle. U-702, his final command, was a Type Willich submarine, capable, reliable, but offering no advantages against opponents who had learned to hunt with precision and overwhelming numerical superiority. The boats that ventured into the Atlantic with regularity in 1944 returned with fewer tonnage figures recorded in the war diary, if they returned at all. The names of commanders that had been familiar to Bleichrodt, men he had trained alongside, men he had competed against in the grim calculus of merchant ships sunk, began to appear in casualty lists instead of operational reports. The social structure of the U-boat arm, which had always maintained a peculiar camaraderie born from shared danger, began to fracture under the weight of mounting losses. Bleichrodt watched these changes with the clarity of someone who understood that an epoch was ending, that the world he had inhabited for nearly 5 years was dissolving into something unrecognizable. The transition from active hunter to instructor began subtly. Senior commanders with proven track records were increasingly assigned to train younger officers in the theory and practice of submarine warfare. This was partly a practical necessity. The expansion of the U-boat fleet required experienced hands to pass on their knowledge. But it was also something else, a recognition that the men who had survived this long were valuable not as weapons themselves, but as repositories of hard-won experience. Bleichrodt accepted shore duties at various training stations. He stood in classrooms before young officers who had never seen combat, who carried with them the ideological fervor of a state that had invested enormous resources in indoctrinating them. He taught them the mechanics of diesel engines, the geometry of torpedo calculations, the protocols of convoy tactics. He taught them how to read the stars and the sea, how to move silently beneath the surface, how to recognize the acoustic signatures of different ship classes. But he could not teach them the one thing that mattered most: how to survive when every system arranged against you is determined to kill you. These years of transition carried a peculiar psychological weight. Bleichrodt had defined himself through action, through the constant rotation of patrols and combat operations that structured the lives of U-boat officers. The rhythm of that existence had become internalized. The preparation, the departure, the hunt, the return, the debriefing, the repairs, and then the preparation again. It was exhausting, and it was complete. It provided a clarity of purpose that required no philosophical interrogation. Now, separated from that cycle, he existed in a state of suspended uncertainty.